So before we jump into it, just going to tell you a little bit more about who I am and why I'm talking with you about this. So like I mentioned, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at the Waterwise Community Center. I've been obsessed with some aspect of landscaping and gardening for probably approaching the last 20 years now. And one of my focuses of understanding this has long been our relationship with the soil and how to improve our soil and get the most out of it, focused on urban areas. Oftentimes we're starting with soil that has been neglected or in some way abused. And so I've done a lot of both informal experimentation and formal training in soil, compost, some soil biology. And what I have found over the years is that the reality is that most of the books, a lot of the information on the internet about composting, about soils, is really put together by people who live and breathe soil and compost. They're super into it, and they assume everybody else is going to be super into it. They're going to keep their compost pile like a pet and treat it as well as they treat their dog. And what I find working with real people on a daily basis is that that's not what most of us want. And in fact, in reality, it's not really what I want either. And so what this presentation is today is going to kind of filter out a lot of the many, many different options around compost. We'll talk quite a bit about mulches as well, and kind of give you the takeaways for most of us, the most essential information for the average home gardener, and kind of what I found are the easiest systems to maintain, what works well for me. I'm going to be sharing with you pretty much what I do at home when we talk about composting. Mulching, on the other hand, there's really just not a lot of information about mulch out there. At the end of the day, it is pretty simple once you know what you need to know. So, you're not going to find a whole book written about it. However, working with people on a day-to-day basis, I see people make a lot of mistakes that will set their gardens back. And so when we talk about mulch, it's really going to be about demystifying and just really presenting a logical framework for you to make your mulching decisions, make sure your garden looks great, and sets you up for success. So that brings us to the outline of what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what mulch and compost are, the difference between them. We're going to talk about mulch immediately after that. When we talk about mulch, we'll talk about mulch types, where to get these mulch types, how to choose for your garden, and how to use them. And then we're going to transition to compost. And then we'll talk about types of compost and composting, how best to use compost, different options and recommendations for compost containers. And then we will end with my recommended containers and procedures for composting and worm composting. Really simple, low stress systems for doing it at home. I'll basically show you what I do at home for composting. I have so many worms in my compost now that I don't bother keeping a separate worm bin, but I'll show you what my partner and I used to do for worm composting before we kind of made that transition to just having a normal compost pile. And here's the big idea. Using mulch and compost correctly will help keep your plants happy. There's lots of benefits, and we could get into the weeds on the science of the benefits. There's a lot of great content online about that, really cool stuff looking at soil microbiology. If you are into that, poke around on YouTube. You will find tons of stuff. But what I find is that there's not as much high quality information that just keeps it basic and tells you what to do. So we are going to focus on that. And here it is in a nutshell. None of these things are things to do in every part of your garden. Because what you're going to do for your vegetables is going to be different than what you might do for your succulents or your native plants. Basically, when we're using compost and mulch, what we are doing is we are trying to provide conditions more like the natural conditions that our garden plants are adapted to and will thrive in. We're trying to make things a little bit more like the plant's ideal situation. And so what we want to do is know a little bit about our plants and what they want, and then about our options for mulch and compost. And you add that together and you're going to make your plants happier. I've seen a lot of recommendations, for example, saying always add compost with California native plants. The reality is, depending on your soils, for most of us in most of our soils, if we're selecting native plants that are well adapted to where we are, those plants couldn't care less. But the weeds in our yards might really, really thrive with the extra nutrients in the compost. So we often don't need to do that, where for our vegetable gardens, it's usually like the more organic matter we could add, the better. So we're going to get into all of that. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about what mulch is and what compost is, because this is something that I find that a lot of people who are just getting into this are quite confused on. So mulch really is anything that covers the surface of the soil. Usually it's applied 2 to 3 inches thick, and it could be a variety of different substances. So sometimes people use a shorthand of mulch to refer to as like a wood chip type mulch or a ground up kind of tree pruning type mulch. And that's probably most often the case, but it's also can be gravel, decomposed granite, rock, or even compost. Compost just applied as a top layer on top of the soil could be compost used as a mulch. Oftentimes you'll hear the terms organic mulch, and that just refers to anything that will break down. So usually organic mulch is wood chip mulch, or occasionally, depending on the plants, using compost as a mulch. And then you'll hear the term inorganic mulch, sometimes an aggregate mulch, and that's anything that's mineral based. So rocks, gravels, decomposed granite. And they act a little differently in the garden. So that's going to be the difference. No matter what kind of mulch you're using, mulch will help reduce evaporation from the soil surface, which in the summer months can go a long way towards holding water in the garden. It basically, if the sun is beating down on your soil surface, not only can that dry the very top, but depending on your soil structure, if you have decent soil structure, water is able to move both horizontally and vertically in the soil. So as the top dries out, it can actually wick soil moisture up to the top and continue to dry it out. Putting a couple inches of any sort of material on the top of the soil shades it and cuts off that evaporative kind of chain, you might call it. In addition to that, and particularly useful for California native plants in our gardens, is that it shades the surface of the soil and keeps it a little bit cooler than it would be than if the sun was beating directly down on it. And the reason why that is important for California native plants is that a lot of our native plants, while we might water them deeply once a month or so in Southern California to keep them from going dormant, looking a little better, they're not really adapted to life in our Mediterranean climate with hot, wet soil, other than some of our plants from the true desert where they might get some thunder showers. Our local native plants in most of Southern California, it just doesn't rain in the summer and they can go dormant. So we might water them once a month, but we want to keep the soil as cool as possible when we do that. Having a layer of some sort of mulch helps with that quite a bit if we are going to be irrigating. It also helps prevent existing weed seeds in the soil from germinating and can help prevent new seeds from blowing in and germinating as well. New seeds that blow in will germinate in decomposed granite or mulch, but it's less than if it was just an open surface. And then finally, if it is organic, like a mixed wood chip based mulch, it will eventually break down and add organic matter to the soil. Usually there's a few kinds of wood chip mulches that don't really do that, and we'll talk about those when we go through the different mulch types. Now, as opposed to that, we also have compost. Now, compost is organic matter that has decomposed, and it's broken down in a process called composting. So if you just lay organic matter out, whether it's wood chips or banana peels or apple cores or anything like that, over time it will break down. But by composting it, we are controlling the process and assuring we get a nice outcome and a nice finished product. And compost, if done well, will enrich the soil with organic matter and nutrients. And that does some pretty magical things. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but essentially that will help build what's called soil structure, which helps helps retain moisture, helps hold moisture in the soil. I've heard different studies, different conditions, but adding a good quality of organic matter to a sandy soil has been proven to help the soil retain, upwards of like 6 times as much moisture, within that top foot kind of root zone. So it can really make a big difference, especially if you're gardening in sandy or gravelly soils. It can also build soil structure for clay soils and help it have a better drainage and infiltration as well. It feeds beneficial soil microbes, which are very important in making nutrients available to our plants, and can be made with many different types of organic material as starting inputs. And so we'll get way deeper into that during the compost section. So have a question coming in about the benefits of compost for clay soil. We will touch on that more as we get going into the compost section. But first, we are going to start with mulch. So mulch types. The most common mulch type that I see in Southern California is kind of a mixed ground tree trimmings. This is basically a mixture of different species, normally produced locally by yards that will take all the stuff coming from arborists, tree trimmers, grind it all up into a mix. Now, depending on the equipment that they're using, the grind might be a little bit finer, might be a little bit coarser. This is the material that we give away at the Waterwise Community Center in our free mulch giveaway program. I'll talk a little bit more about that for those of you who are local in just a moment. It's what I use at home. I really like it. Works really well for me. It's a finer grind, which some people think looks a little bit nicer. There's some larger chunks in it. A coarser grind will actually last a little bit longer. This does break down a little bit faster, but it's great for building soil. And for me, as long as it's mixed species that are ground up together from healthy trees, I will take what's free and readily available to me. Depending on the size of your project, how much you need, when you need it, you might buy something like this. This is just an example. There's a local materials yard called OF Wolfenbarger where we live, and they have a mixed product that they call Chino Chip. And so this is a picture of that. You can see it's a little bit coarser, but it's essentially the same material. And when it's laid down, it ends up looking something like this. And this is a pretty good default starting point for any Waterwise garden. I would say unless you have a reason to do otherwise, and we'll talk about that, starting with 2 to 3 inches of wood chip mulch, you're really not going to go wrong as a first application installation starting point. Now, in a natural style garden, which a lot of people are looking for these days, this is a picture of a section of my young backyard before plants had really grown in. You can actually grow your own mulch and also kind of mix things up. So this was our starting point, free wood chip mulch, about a 3-inch thick layer. But over time, as the plants grow and I'm trimming plants, most of the time when I do a native garden, I like things to grow in, be a pretty nice plant density, not just a plant here and a plant there in a pool of mulch or a sea of mulch. I'm really only needing to remulch my pathways if they're just kind of a natural wood chip pathway. Because as the plants grow in, start dropping their own leaves, and I'm pruning, I will take some of those prunings and just kind of chop them up and lay them out in the ground. And that's all the remulching with the leaf drop that it needs. And so I'm not needing to bring in tons and tons of wood chips into the actual planting area year after year. Usually I say that this is kind of one and done kind of mulching because I'm only needing to bring in a lot of wood chips for the planting area just right at the time of planting. Usually within a couple of years, it's filled in pretty well. And by using some of those choppings, it's keeping more of the green waste on site. Those actual plant prunings that's naturally how these areas mulch. It's usually what's best for the plant and also best for habitat because, for example, if you're trimming things and there's old seed heads and a little bit of seeds left in them. There's different styles of branches. Some are hollow, some are solid. You'll get different pollinators that burrow and live in them. You'll get different bird species coming around picking through for the seeds. Adds a lot to the habitat aspect of the garden, but it takes some time. So here's just an example of kind of mixing things up where at a bottom part of my yard, again, this isn't grown in yet. Here's some old wildflowers that the birds were still picking through, so we had left them to dry. And so over time, just as we have access to little bits of rock and cobble, these are things that we actually ended up digging up from the yard as we were working on a project to dig a dry stream bed, just kind of adding them in here and there for a naturalistic look over time. And so you can see here what I'm talking about, where it's not all wall-to-wall wood chip, mixing in some gravel, some stone, a log here and there, really helps make more of a naturalistic look in a natural garden. Personally, I'm not a fan of just wall-to-wall brown wood chip. I don't think that looks very natural in a natural garden. But if that's the look that you like, that's fine too. And so this is more of the style that I personally do at home. This is an area where we recently planted this part of the garden. This is the young manzanita, a little bit slower to get going. And so you can see here in the foreground, and this is just from a couple of weeks ago. As the season goes on, this will break down more. But I recently did the fall pruning of this Cleveland sage plant in the background. And so instead of needing to bring in more wood chip mulch, use those, and you can see the dried salvia seed heads. This is great habitat for beneficial insects. And then we also see lots and lots of native birds coming through picking for the seeds. We get towhees and doves, especially, really enjoying the seeds once they're on the ground, even more so than they don't really go into the bushes when they're on. We get finches when they're on the bushes, and then other birds after they are down on the ground. Now, just one caveat for this approach. I really like this approach, but if you are in an urban wildlife interface zone, so locally, that's like parts of Chino Hills, parts of Upland, Rancho Cucamonga, you might be elsewhere, but if you back up to a natural area where fire is a concern, we just had a fire very recently in Chino Hills, and I was working with some people on a design where the fire burnt the slope underneath their house. This is not something you want to do in an urban wildlife interface zone. This can, if there is a fire right in your backyard, this isn't what you want as kind of your mulch layer. I am right in the middle of urban Pomona. I don't have that concern, so I can kind of maximize the environmental aspects, the habitat aspects with my mulch layer. Just saw a question come in about if I eventually work this into the ground. No, this just all stays on the surface, and over time, it will break down, fracture into smaller pieces. Over time, much slower than a compost pile, it will decompose. Earthworms will bring down parts of it. But for mulching, never work it into the ground. It's just top dressing. And eventually, as it breaks down, it will build the soil. And especially with starting with wood chip mulch, I've had garden projects where soil is very sandy and very compacted, doesn't drain well, and maintain a thick layer of wood chip mulch for 3 years. I think the project I'm thinking about, touched it up after the initial once or twice in that area, and without mixing anything in, just with that decomposition and the critters coming back and just recharging the soil food web with those carbon sources breaking down, totally changed the feel of the soil underneath, magically kind of loosened things up, increased drainage. It's really amazing what can be done with top dressing with the right material. But it's important that it's the right material. And those are some of the subtleties that there's often not good information about. And so we will talk about that as we get through the different mulch types. And so this is just one more quick part about the tangent of the natural mulching. And so this is an area a little less than a year after planting. And then this is just last week ago, this young sage plant here is growing pretty well overall, but did just have on this backside one branch that had died out in the summer. So pruned that and just wanted to take a picture so you can see here that natural mulching starting to happen. So you can see there's some of the wood chip, but then all of these are kind of leaves, a lot from that sage and from some of the other plants around, starting to build up that natural mulch layer. If a lot of those leaves are accumulating right at the base of the plant, you might want to kind of rake those back just with a gloved hand every once in a while. You always want to have around your native and water-wise plants, ideally about 3 inches of just bare soil without mulch or a lot of accumulation of leaf litter. Touching the base of the plant. If it's really touching the base of the woody part of the plant where it goes into the soil, it can promote rot over time. If you have a big shrub, you obviously don't need to get in there every week and pull the leaves back, but every once in a while checking can help keep the plant doing well. But other than that, just allow that to accumulate as your new mulch layer. As long as the plant is healthy, there aren't any disease issues, you don't want to be raking that up and putting it in the green waste. That's great material. So just one other example of kind of the natural mulch. Took this picture right near the parking lot of Tree of Life Native Plant Nursery in San Juan Capistrano. And you can see very natural, some rock, probably started with some wood chip, but now just the leaves are kind of doing what it needs to do. They probably sweep off the rocks every once in a while maybe, and then those leaves can just kind of filter in the open areas in between. And so the type of mulch that I've been showing, you can often get that for free if you are willing to do a little bit of the work. So for those of you near us, we have a free mulching compost giveaway program. Our headquarters is in the city of Montclair, kind of near the Monte Vista exit of the 10 freeway, where our property is just south of the freeway. And so we recently modified our program to be contactless. And essentially, we keep a pile of the mulch that I showed you, that same stuff that I use at home. It's mixed ground arborist trimmings right here in our parking lot. And people can come whenever they want. And we just ask people to keep some space between them, wear masks. You bring your own tools and your own containers, or you can fill up the back of the pickup truck. And we're able to just keep that pile refreshed whenever it gets low with our relationship with our local company that produces that green waste. We almost always have that mulch, but if you want to call ahead just to make sure it's not like the morning where we just ran out and are getting a new drop before you come down, you can always call the main line at our office at the Waterwise Community Center just to confirm that it is available. We also have free compost, which we keep in this section of the parking lot. I'll talk more about that later. We are able to get only 1 load of that compost a month. And so if you're going to want to get that free compost, the best way to know when it's available, because it's not always on the same day, is to sign up for our social media. And we'll do a social media post as soon as that is dropped off. And so that is locally, if you can haul it yourself and load it yourself, that's one option for free mulch. Another option is to work with local tree trimmers. Like if there's a tree trimmer with the grinder on the back of their truck in their neighborhood, oftentimes they're going to need to pay to dump that. So you can kind of flag them down and ask if they want to leave it in your driveway. Usually if you work with a local arborist though, they're going to want to dump their entire load, which can be up to 20 yards of mulch, might even be quite a bit bigger than this pile. It just depends on how much they have. So you're going to need to kind of be ready for it. And then the quality is going to be whatever they have. So I've definitely done that plenty of times for my front yard and backyard. I've always been pretty satisfied, but it depends on the look you want, what you're going for as well. And then a relatively new option, not an official endorsement. I've never used it, but it's something that I hear a lot of people talking about. So wanted to put it all on your radars, is a service called Chip Drop. And you can take a look at it at chipdrop.com. Essentially, it's a service where homeowners who are going to want mulch from local tree trimmers, when it's available in their neighborhood, can sign up, put a bunch of information. You have to have an area where the tree trimmer can pretty much drop it whenever they have it. You don't know when it's going to come, but essentially you go onto a list on an app that the tree trimmers can access, and then you might have it show up. So there's a lot of information about figuring out if this is right for you or not at their website. But if you're interested, you can check it out. And you don't know exactly how much you're going to get. And then sometimes there's things like pine needles, lawn trimmings, and stuff like that in it. So it's kind of a coarser option. So you'll know if that works for you. And then if you want to know you're going to have this many yards dropped off at your house at this day, you can buy it through local landscape materials yards. Just saw a question that came in about if there's a free compost and mulch only for people within our service area. It is open to the public. We provide it as a service for people within our service area, but it doesn't cost us anything. It's a free program with local providers. It doesn't cost us anything to have it just kind of be open to the public. And we're not there meeting people and having people write down their addresses. So it is kind of come whoever you are. Yeah, if you're in one of our kind of local nearby communities, you're welcome to participate in the program. Now, realistically, there's only so much mulch you can fit, even if you're filling up a whole pickup truck. So if you're doing your whole yard, it's not going to be worth it to drive from very far away. But if you're from like Pomona or Claremont or one of our local areas, you're welcome to use it. And then just one comment that came in from someone in the East Bay, Ray. Thanks for joining us all the way from the Bay Area, Ray. He used chip drop and they dropped off very quickly, but he said that the wood was not as well ground as he had hoped for. He'd seen other people get piles that were better ground. Pile was very large, so he gave a lot to the neighbors. And that's something I've heard of people doing, is kind of the whole neighborhood, kind of is going to take some of it. So it's, you get what you pay for, and you're just kind of rolling the dice a little bit, but you do have the convenience of getting it dropped off. If you look at the number of yards in a 20-yard load, I mean, that's going to be 20 yards of mulch delivered to your house from a soil yard is going to cost you upwards of $500. So, it's up to you how particular you want to be based on the grind and what might be in it. For me personally, I'm always going to find a way to get free mulch that's available and deal with, even if I need to green waste some branches that are in it, because I just can't stomach personally paying $500 for mulch. The nice thing about paying, though, is that if you only need a few yards, you're not going to get stuck with a huge pile. So you don't necessarily need to buy $500 worth of mulch to have it dropped off. So that'll transition us to talking a little bit about other mulch sources. So many landscape materials yards sell and deliver mulch. For those of you who are in our local kind of very eastern Los Angeles County, western San Bernardino County area, we maintain a local landscape suppliers list, and that is at that same place, cbwcd.org/presentations. I'll have that pushed up to the top right underneath the presentation from today if you want to download our local landscape suppliers list. So it will mention the materials yards and if they're ones that sell mulch. I have right after this presentation, I found out about a couple more local materials yards when I was putting together this presentation. So I'm going to update that a little bit, but it will be up by the end of the day. The materials, the grinds, and the quality, and also the cost vary depending on where you are getting your mulch from. And some of the yards will have like 5-6 different grinds of mulch, different plant species that go into it. Honestly, I do prefer what's usually one of their cheaper ones, which is just those mixed arborist trimmings. Has the most natural look and is actually the best for building your soil. And so that's nice that the cheaper one is the best one. But I would recommend, don't order 10, 20 yards of something that you haven't seen. Go down to the yard and check it out and make sure that it's what you're looking for. Delivery, though, can be cost prohibitive for small amounts, depending on what you need. They charge by the truck delivery, regardless of the quantity, at least in our areas. And the rates will vary by the company and the mileage. But I will often, based on different projects from all sorts of different suppliers around the San Gabriel Valley through kind of Pomona Valley. Often I've ended up, when I've had to bring things in on a commercial job, paying roughly around $80 a fee per truck. And the price that you would be paying for this kind of mixed arborist trimming mulch, kind of nice version of it, very consistent, it's going to be, $26, $28 per cubic yard, which is about what fits in the back of a small pickup truck. So if you only need a couple of yards, the delivery is going to be really, really proportionately expensive. Might be something to check with all your neighbors who see if any of them need mulch, and maybe all kind of chip in together to maximize a load or something like that. And then if you do have access to a pickup truck, most of these materials yards will also load your pickup truck with the tractor. They're pretty efficient at it. And then a few of them will also sell bags of their same bulk product. They kind of just like a paper sack, kind of the size of like a sack that you would get at the hardware store. But they'll kind of bag their bulk products. Some of them will do it with their mulch. Some of them will only do it with their stone products. So call ahead, see what your options are. Here's just the reality. Hardware stores, Home Depot, Lowe's, big box stores, even the mom and pop nurseries, you cannot buy good wood chip mulch at the hardware store or most nurseries. Sometimes the independent nurseries will have a bulk bin and sell it in bulk, kind of like in the back of the nursery. Then you might be able to get good stuff. Normally they'll get it from like a local soil yard who, sells it all the time. But they just, the stuff that I recommend, those mixed arborist trimmings, you just can't buy it at the big box hardware store. They're bark nuggets. They're the painted stuff. It's not the stuff you want. And if you do buy it that way, it's a lot of plastic waste. So it's not what I recommend. And then before we move on, I just want to break down for you, for those of you who are either going to be using a pickup truck, or have your own, borrowing a pickup truck. And this is something that you might refer back to if you download the slides. I probably won't read every word in the interest of time, but if you have a small pickup truck, like a Toyota Tacoma, something like that, I have a 4-cylinder Toyota Tacoma. You can do about 1 yard of mulch in the back, maybe a little bit less if you heap it. And then if you're talking about doing gravel or decomposed granite, it's a lot heavier. So you're going to be looking at half that at the most, half yard of gravel, probably less of decomposed granite. For me, I just have kind of the base model. Even before I'm dealing with like hauling gravel, even before I'm dealing with like what my engine can pull, I'm going to be maxed out on my suspension. I think a little bit less than half the yard of gravel. So depending on your options, your engine might be a little bit different. Roughly mid-sized pickups with a 6-foot bed, something like an F-150, you're probably looking at 2 yards of mulch, maybe 3/4 of a yard of gravel or decomposed granite. And then with 8-foot beds, 3 yards of mulch, probably. Mulch is lightweight, but probably not that much more on gravel or decomposed granite just because of the weight. If you're going to be trying to maximize your loads, pushing that capacity, check your vehicle's capacity and also check with the supplier about the weight of their product per scoop. They might have more detail for you because they're dealing with loading and offloading and trucks and weight all the time. And you really want to make sure you're being safe with it. Check your tire pressure and remember that your acceleration will be totally different. And even more importantly than that, your brakes are going to respond a lot slower, not necessarily with mulch as much, but definitely if you're moving gravel, mulch, as opposed to wood chips or decomposed granite. I mean, it's when I'm hauling gravel in the back of my truck, it's driving a totally different vehicle. So on the freeway, have to drive much more conservatively. So just a couple of notes. Hopefully that's useful if you've not done it before. And so we're going to look at some other organic mulches briefly. These are ones that are often available depending on the soil yard, sometimes in bulk. Oftentimes these are also things that are bagged at the hardware store and nursery. So bark nuggets, not generally what I recommend, not the worst stuff depending on what you are looking for. Some people like the look. Bark nuggets to me are pretty much neutral. They don't break down and build the soil like the mixed arborist trimmings, but they also don't cause some of the problems that other mulches cause. So they do last for a long time, which is good. I personally don't really like the look. It doesn't look that natural to me once it's over a whole landscape. They just kind of sit there. So they do cover the soil, they do shade the soil, but that's kind of the end of the limitations. I will say, especially with using organic mulches that are going to break down, as well as overall in general, I don't recommend using that black kind of plastic fabric weed barrier. Causes a lot of problems over time. If you want to know more about that, you can join us or look at the recording of our landscape transformation basics class or our removing your lawn the right way class. We go way into that there. If, however, you have just decided you are going to use that, your personal decision, I actually don't recommend a mixed arborist trimming wood chip bark, because all of that stuff as it breaks down, or a wood chip mulch, all of that great stuff as it breaks down, if you have that black weed barrier, it can't ever become part of the soil. And so it breaks down and then just clogs up all of the little kind of micro perforations in that weed barrier that are supposed to allow air and water through. And as that breakdown, it kind of causes a layer of almost like dried compost. It's not very nice stuff on top of that weed barrier, and then weeds start germinating in that. So it is not what I recommend, but if you are going to use that weed barrier and do some sort of organic mulch, the bark nuggets are about your best choice. That's about the one decent thing I could say for that. Color mulch, I'd say just avoid it. Sometimes the content in the wood chips can be some weird recycled material. The color itself is usually non-toxic and relatively harmless, but aesthetically, I think we can do better than this. To me, that red wood chip stuff, some people think that it's ornamental, but when you end up seeing it over a large area of the garden, it just does not look very nice. And the color fades, and then the mulch itself, the grind of the chip, just does not look good after that color fades. Gorilla hair mulch. Gorilla hair mulch is seen as kind of a fancy premium mulch. It definitely comes with a premium price tag. It is also, in the vast majority of cases, not what I recommend. Basically, it's shredded cedar or redwood bark. It lasts for a long time because it does not decompose. It has those properties of the cedar or redwood bark that make it not decompose. It doesn't build soil because it doesn't decompose, but what it does is it kind of just dries out and desiccates and mats down on top of the soil. I've actually seen it cause significant issues with absorbing a lot of the water from irrigation and not allowing it to penetrate. If you're using overhead irrigation into the soil, or in a small rain event, no water might get through to the soil, and then it just kind of packs down over time, starts to not look as good. People add more on, and the thicker it gets, the problems just kind of compound. Additionally, it's nasty stuff to work with. The dust is easy to breathe in, feels really bad on your lungs. And a lot of people, if you have sensitive skin at all, or even for people who don't have sensitive skin, I find it very irritating to work with. If I need to, usually if I'm involved with it, it's taking it out to put in a better mulch, and I always wear long sleeves and gloves. In addition to that, if you're in an area where fire is a concern, the stuff is flammable. The one potential good thing about it, and for example, like the area that we have it in our demonstration garden, is along the main street. We have a very steep slope bermed up against the building where normal wood chip mulch would not stick to that slope. And gorilla hair is the one thing that will stick to that slope, and it's too steep for even gravel in that area, and it will help prevent erosion. So that's kind of my take on gorilla hair mulch. And rubber mulch, just don't use it. It's toxic, potentially. I mean, obviously the companies won't say that, but it's normally ground up recycled tires. And so all the toxicity issues that kind of dumping tires has potentially to deal with, that's going to be in that mulch. It's not natural. It basically, over time, if it breaks down, it's just microplastics in your landscape, and it's flammable. I mean, you can, if you're in an urban wildlife interface zone or an area that's fire prone, you can basically end up with a tire fire in your yard for using this rubber mulch. Doesn't really do much good for the landscape. And so now we're going to talk a bit about aggregate or gravel mulches, because there is a place for that if it is done well. What we saw in kind of the first widespread round of turf removals in Southern California is that there were some companies that were doing these kind of real, not very good landscape jobs where they'd rip out the turf, put down the plastic weed barrier, and put down like wall-to-wall 3/4 inch gravel and a few plants. Not what I'm talking about, but gravel done well for the right plants can be appropriate, can look very nice and natural, and can be a good solution for the landscape. But with gravels, there's a lot of different types. And so it might be everything from pea gravel, as you can see here. I am a fan of using, if it's an aggregate kind of landscape sometimes, and also for like patios or walking paths, a very small gravel called bird's eye gravel. It's harder to find, but sometimes it's a nice component in the landscape. One of the materials yards for people who are local, I've only found it at one place locally. It's a place called Resource Building Materials in Chino, and that's on our landscape suppliers list. Pea gravel's pretty easy to find. And then another thing that I really like and is part of my default mix of gravels if I'm going to do a gravel mulch is an 1.5-inch gravel, which has, there's some crushed material, but a lot of it is natural kind of washed and screened river rock. That can also be harder to find. And the place that has one is not always the place that has the other. So for example, this I've only found locally at a place called OF Wolfenbarger, different yard in Chino. So if I want to mix the two, I'm going to need to be getting stuff from multiple different yards, which is sometimes worth the hassle. And so always, again, visit your yard and check your options. I really prefer to work with our kind of different tones and sizes of our local river rock, and especially after it's washed off and the dust is off of it, looks quite a bit nicer. Main reason why, and if you're from outside our local area, you know, your local stuff might look different. But the main reason why I like to use the local stuff is that you can get different sizes of it, so you can obtain a very natural kind of look in your garden. Usually it is by far the cheapest material as well in terms of gravels. Wood chip mulch is always going to be cheaper, but in terms of gravels, this local stuff is going to be the cheapest. And then also, if we look at the environmental kind of impacts, I'd want to use something that was kind of quarried and produced locally, not something that's been driven in from Northern California, necessarily Arizona. Sometimes people are bringing in rocks from Canada, and you can't fit a whole lot of volume of rock on a truck before it's weighed down. So there's a lot of kind of energy that goes into just kind of bringing gravels here and there. So I'd like to work with the local stuff. Now, there are some other relatively local, from farther out options from kind of the deserts of California. This is an example. It's called California Gold. It's a 3/4 inch. Some people like that look. Again, with this, you can normally, sometimes you can get really expensive boulders of it, but you can't get the smaller or the mid-range sizes. So once you put down, if you're doing a large landscape, more than just a planter bed, you know, wall-to-wall front yard and this stuff, it starts to look very artificial because it's all the same size. It's also at least 2 to 3 times more expensive than the more local granite material by volume. And some of the other kind of gravels, there's lots of different other ones, are also 2 to 3 times more expensive. So I prefer to stay with the natural looking local stuff. So this is gravel not done particularly well. 3/4 inch crushed local gravel, but just one size, using the crushed material, which is much more angular. Don't even think about doing something like this. That wall-to-wall black lava rock is just going to be so hot and oppressive in the landscape. The plants aren't going to like all that reflected heat. You know, that little, if you have like one tiny little area of succulents or to top off a pot with some succulents, you know, go for it. But whole landscape, don't do it. So this is what I consider a gravel mulch to be done very well in Southern California. This front yard landscape in Rancho Cucamonga was just someone I met who was visiting our demonstration garden, and he shared this picture of his front yard with me. Just a DIY project, the first project he took on, landscape project he's ever done. But I thought that this was really beautiful. You can see here, working with the local tones of gravel and rock. You can see local stuff is everything from browns to grays. The larger stones are buried, you know, a third, halfway into the ground. It looks very natural. And then using a small, either probably a pea gravel or maybe a bird's eye gravel, mixing some other kind of cobble into it, and then a separate area that's done with decomposed granite, which we're about to talk about in the back. Just a really nice mix of materials. And this is how to achieve a natural look that solves the mulch functions. It's appropriate for this dry and some desert material landscape, but it adds to the look of the landscape. It's not just about, you know, throwing something down. It's very intentional. So I think that this is kind of what to shoot for if you're going to be working with gravels. What are the advantages of gravels? Well, it's going to enhance the look and be fine with your plant material, that material that's either desert or kind of chaparral. That's good. And then the other advantage is that, like wood chip mulch, as it breaks down, you need to refresh it if the plants aren't mulching themselves. So if you have a more sparse landscape that's not going to be kind of close to wall-to-wall plants, then you're kind of done well once and done with the aggregate or the gravel. You're not going to have to refresh it constantly all the time. You might just need to you know, pull some leaves out of it every once in a while. So it's going to cost a lot more at the beginning, but then you're going to be done. And then decomposed granite mulch. So when you hear the term decomposed granite, this is what we're talking about. Get it from the same kind of landscape materials yards as you would get the stone. They don't all carry it. Oftentimes, it's in different colors. Usually it's some variation of this is called a gold. Sometimes you hear California gold, pyrite gold down here. Depending on the source, the different yards, even if it's a gold color, will look a little bit different. So generally, if you're adding more, replacing it over time, and you want a consistent look, once you choose where you're going to source it from, go back to the same place. Or sometimes you'll get something that the tone looks just a little off if you order it from a different place for the next time you get it. And so this is it. And so here you can see it applied in the landscape. It often looks good with a little bit of stone or maybe even a little gravel mixed in for a natural look, and is usually best used with Mediterranean or true desert plants. But there's a few caveats. It can be a very nice material. It's also often used in public spaces as well as pathways or patios, and has a nice kind of crunch underneath your foot, but it's more stable for foot traffic if it's installed well than gravel, and wheelchairs can roll on it. So for a public facility that needs to be wheelchair accessible, it's a good option. Normally, if you're doing a patio or pathway, you're using it and you can get it with what's called a binder in it, where it's wet to a certain amount, it's put down and it's compacted. Whereas if you're using it in a landscape, you're just putting it down loose without the binder. Over time, it'll compact just a little bit itself, but you're not trying to mechanically compact everything. And with the binders, it's not really great for the landscape, the soil, to have all that compaction and all that stuff in it. The binder is a natural product. It still is relatively permeable to water afterwards, but not like you would want it in your planter. And decomposed granite could be great in the right area, but it's not as adaptable as the wood chip mulch or the gravels. And the reason why is because it only works well on pretty much level areas. If it's on a slope, even if it's just kind of a gentle slope, when it rains, or if you have overhead sprinklers, it will erode and run off. And if it's a big rain event, it can cause a total mess, because it'll often, like in a front yard, it'll run off onto the sidewalk. And then when it dries out, even just that little bit can be a trip hazard for people walking by on the sidewalk. It's also best not to use it, especially for walkways right next to the house, because a little bit of it can get tracked on shoes or dog paws. And if you don't have some sort of area that's like concrete or pavers or something that will naturally kind of have it fall off your shoes, you can bring it into the house, where it, even just a little bit at a time, will totally cause a mess, can scratch wood floors, all that sort of stuff. And then also, when decomposed granite gets wet, even if it's the stuff with the binder, it gets muddy when it's wet. And so you really have to wait until it dries out to walk on it. Whereas with the wood chips and the gravel, that's not an issue. So it can be beautiful in the right place, but you have to be really careful with your application. I've seen it used wrong quite a bit. It can cause quite a bit of problems. And then oftentimes, especially if you're using the aggregate mulch, but also if you're using the wood chip mulch, mixing in some cobble or boulders can be really nice for the look as well. It can also help build some little niches for habitat. If you're going to be getting boulders from one of those local material yards, this is often how you'll see it in different sizes. Again, all sorts of different crazy colors at a lot of the yards, but I do still prefer that local kind of granite-based material. And with this, you're going to be paying for it by the pound. For our local kind of river rock material, currently calling around Southern California and kind of locally, like San Gabriel to Pomona Valley, different yards are charging everywhere from 8 cents a pound to 15 cents a pound. And the poundage adds up really quickly on this stuff. So again, call around, and the price with the place with the best price for the stone may or may not be the best price for the gravel. So doing a little bit of hunting is definitely in your best interest. So a couple of pictures of more pictures of gravel or aggregate mulches done well. So a few from a Los Angeles-based landscape architecture firm called Terremoto. They're also in the Bay Area that does very high-end projects, but they're really have a great use of materials and planting design as well. So you can see a more small gravel. This is probably something similar to the bird's eye gravel. Sometimes they'll do a decomposed granite with just a little bit of gravel on top of it, and then some other stone. One of the nice things about the gravel mulches is that you can really very kind of elegantly sweep from walkways to planted areas, and it all feels very natural. So here's another kind of courtyard where that's the case, kind of intermixed with pavers. There's another local landscape architect, Ecotone Studios, and this is actually a very fancy driveway that they did, kind of sweeping with the gravel right into the planters. And so under the driveway area, there's actually probably a plastic grid to support the vehicle traffic filled with the gravel. But then in terms of what the eye sees, then it just sweeps right to the planters where it's soil with just the gravel mulch. And also kind of mixing it up. So here with the water retention feature, mulch in some areas, wood chip mulch in some areas, then gravel and stone. Very naturalistic look. It's a landscape designed by Tim Becker, who's the director of horticulture at the Theodore Payne Foundation for Native Plants. So you can see here, wood chip mulch, but enough stone that stone becomes a very prevalent element of the landscape covering. So to kind of get towards the end of the mulch section, and then we'll spend proportionately more time on compost because there's just more to get into, just to kind of set up what you're looking at as you make mulch decisions. Want to look at some cost comparisons of making different mulch decisions to cover 1,000 square feet of landscape, just because that's a nice round number, 3 inches deep. Now, for our Waterwise and native plants, in terms of what I find is needed for the horticulture, I often find that 2 inches is just fine. However, people are encouraged, especially for the wood chip mulches, to go a little bit deeper for maximizing the water savings as the material breaks down. It is true that with the wood chip mulches, going a little deeper will mean that it's longer till you have to replace it. And if you're doing the turf replacement rebate through the Metropolitan Water District or SoCalWatersmart.com, they do require a 3-inch mulch layer. So we're going to use that 3-inch layer. So how do you figure out how much mulch you need for your project? Well, the internet is the easy way to do it. If you're mathematically inclined, you can do inches and convert it to cubic yards, but there are mulch calculators online that are free and very quick to use that will just do that math for you. And so you do want to figure out roughly what the square footage of your landscape area is. That's an absolute must. And so if you just go to Google and type in mulch calculator, there's a couple that comes up. This is the one that I've just used for years. It's landscapecalculator.com, but I find it's like the second one you click on if you just type in mulch calculator into a search engine. And it's very simple. You put in your area in square feet and your depth in inches, and you click calculate, and it gives you your outputs of your cubic yards of mulch, which is normally if you're ordering for a large garden area from the soil yard, that you're going to order in yards. They sell it in half-yard increments, and so you'll have to round up or round down. And then also 2 and 3 cubic foot bags, which again, the stuff that you're really going to want, usually you can't really source it in the bags anyways. And so you're going to look at that yardage. Here we have 9.26. So what I have just found over the years is that normally if I round up, I end up with a lot of extra material. It seems like, and it might just be because the scoops are not that accurate. I don't know if the soil yards tend to make sure they give you a little bit extra instead of not enough, but it is rare if I kind of do this calculation for a whole yard, a decent sized project. It's rare that I find myself with not enough material, and it is often that I find myself with more material than I really needed. So unless, for example, like here, unless it's really close to 9.5, I'll tend to round down if I don't have a place to store the extra material. Like if it's wood chip mulch and I have, I'm doing a front yard and yeah, I could use some in the backyard, I'll round up to be sure. But if it's gravel and I just don't have another good place on the property to store the gravel, I'll probably tend to round down to make sure I just don't have too much material. So for here, we're going to round down to 9 yards of material for the example. And so these costs are going to be not including delivery or taxes, but just kind of roughly what I normally see at our local yards in Southern California for the costs for our 3 inches over that 1,000 square foot area. Wood chip mulch for that mixed arborist trimmings, not super fancy stuff, which is not the stuff we need anyways. $26 per yard, looking at $234 in mulch costs. Our local gravels, the bird's eye, the pea gravel, things like that, looking at, depending on the yard and the product, $48 to $72 per yard. So $432 to $648. So 2 to 3 times more expensive pretty much. Those exotic gravels, we're all the way up to $140 and $172 per yard. So twice that again. So now we're up to $1,260 to a little over $1,500 to cover that area materials costs. And then the decomposed granite, we're at about $76 per yard on average, give or take some. So $684. So definitely, even if you're buying the wood chip mulch, you're going to see that that's going to be immediately the best bang for your buck. Now, over time, it's going to require replacement. And if you're not going to be able to get it yourself, don't have a pickup truck or easy access, that's going to add up, especially when you're looking at $80 per truck delivery fee. So that would just be for the wood chip mulch because it's lighter. They can fit usually at least 20 yards on a truck. Some yards, supply sources have trucks that can do up to 40 yards. But oftentimes the gravel deliveries, in terms of what trucks can get into a residential neighborhood and dump there, you might only be looking at 10 yards per truck, kind of similar delivery fee. So for this example, you're probably going to be pretty good no matter what. But with the wood chip mulch, what you might find happens over time is then you need to touch things up again, and you need to pay kind of for not a huge load, and you need to get that delivered. So I've seen people who, 5 years into their Waterwise garden, they're dropping another $500 just to get wood chips delivered for their yards. So it might add up over time. That's why I'm really a fan of that wood chip mulch once, and then working with tree trimmings and then little bits of stone and other things like that over time, gravel, have a friend who has a pile of rock from a landscape project. Okay, I'll take that, bring it into your yard, do something nice with it, that sort of stuff. And so to finish up the mulch part of things, we're going to talk some about selecting mulch for your garden and just a few tips for use in your garden. Then we'll answer some questions, take a brief break, and then go over to focusing on compost. So selecting the mulch type for your garden. It's best to base it on what conditions will match your plant's natural conditions and make them happy. If based on that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, you have multiple options, then you can further decide based on look, cost, and those maintenance considerations over time. And you can mix things in different areas or together, like you saw in the example with part decomposed granite and part gravel. So if you're working with kind of plants from woodland areas, you're going to want a wood chip mulch. That's it. Usually trees, unless they're desert trees, want wood chip mulch underneath it. Kind of in Southern California, sometimes you see oak trees in landscapes or even fruit trees in landscapes with like gravel or decomposed granite underneath. Not what they want. Those plants evolved to be basically having their own leaves, creating a rich organic atmosphere underneath their canopies. That's what they want to be happy and healthy long term. But if we start to look at some of our flowering native shrubs, or even like desert plants and succulents, some of those plants really grow in pretty lean conditions where there's a lot of rock, not a whole lot of organic matter. And so a light layer of organic matter is fine, but also gravel or decomposed granite will be just fine for general Mediterranean plants, things like lavenders or our local California native plants. But very important, never have the mulch touching the base of the trunk or the stems of the plants, especially with wood chip mulch, because those will do their job and hold moisture. That can promote rot and disease. So whenever you mulch, you want to keep your mulch held back a minimum of 3 inches or more from the stems. And that's not to say like if the branches or if you have a shrub like away from the center where that main trunk hits the ground, they can touch down onto the mulch. But that main trunk, that root crown area, at least 3 inches or more away. And every so often, especially when the plant is young and it's easy to check, it's good to check and make sure it's still that way. Pull back if necessary. If you're doing a lot of hand watering to get things established, the mulch tends to move around. And every once in a while, you want to pull things back. Now, when you're planting, or if a contractor is planting, they're trying to get things done. Even as the initial mulching is happening, some of it is going to get up against the trunks. That's just going to happen. And so one of the final cleanups of a new landscape installation is to go through and just kind of check plant by plant and pull the mulch back if you need to. So here it is in just the very specific recommendations. For general Waterwise plantings, I recommend 2 to 3 inches of organic wood chip based mulch, that mixed arborist trimmings. If you have access to different blends, a coarser blend will help it break down more slowly, and a finer blend will break down quicker, which will help build soil organic matter if you have either lots of rock or gravel, very sandy soil, or heavy clay soil. At the end of the day, if you're working with free stuff, which is normally what I do, what you get in terms of the grind is what you can get, and that's just fine. If you're using native plantings, using like sage scrub or chaparral plants, a lot of our flowering native shrubs, most people will do that 2 to 3 inches of organic mulch. After that, let those plants self-mulch and then integrate some stone or gravel as desired. But decomposed granite or gravel are also good options, as we saw. And then again, with those wood chip for woodland plants, 3 inches of organic mulch, nice good layer, and then allow those plants to self-mulch as well. Let those leaves fall over time. As your trees start growing in, you're not going to need to add more. Let those leaves fall and use them as much as possible. Very easy to do with like oak trees. If you have sycamores, sometimes there's just so many seasonal leaves, you'll probably have to put some in the green bin. And if desired, you can integrate some gravel and stone, but mostly have it be that naturalistic organic layer. For true desert plants, you can do a light layer of wood chip mulch if that's what you have available. As long as the plants aren't really buried in it, it will be fine. But if you're really trying to match, you're going to be looking at 2 to 3 inches of gravel or decomposed granite, or that light layer of wood chip mulch. Integrate different sizes of gravel as possible for the look. And then also, if you're working with desert plants, generally you're not going to want just 1 or 2 plants in a sea of that gravel mulch. Especially in hot inland Southern California, you're going to want to have your plant density be sufficient to keep the landscape looking nice and not just feeling like a hot and oppressive kind of just wall-to-wall rock, and use some desert trees to cool things down and really help have a nice natural look. And then for fruit trees, pretty simple. 4 to 6 inches of wood chip mulch. This has been studied. 4 inches will give you your maximum benefits in terms of the benefits of mulch for wood chips. Just fine to go up to 6 inches. The main benefit will be to that you just don't need to remulch as quickly. So if you have access to more material, no problem going up to 6 inches. I've actually done even thicker before, but 4 to 6 of wood chip is the general recommendation. Quick question that came in from Miriam as we were going: how does gravel or granite mulch help to enrich the soil? It actually doesn't. If you want to enrich your soil, you need that organic wood chip mulch to break down. It does help in terms of just covering, shading the soil, preventing the evaporation from the top of the soil, the sun's not hitting it, keeping the soil a little bit cooler. So it does have some of the benefits, but it does not actually actively improve the soil like the wood chip mulch breaking down does. Now, if you have well-draining soil to start with, and you're working with Mediterranean or dryland California native plants, that might be just fine. Those plants are adapted to our local soil, so we don't necessarily need to improve it. If you're choosing plants that are well matched to it, you might not need to worry about it if you have well-drained soil. And then question coming in from Kat: how far out do you mulch under the fruit trees? Great question. You want to basically do it through the root zone. So with a mature fruit tree, I'll start my mulch about 6 inches away from the trunk. And in general, I will go at least 1/3 farther from the edge of the canopy, because that's going to be the main root zone. The roots don't really concentrate, the feeder roots and the roots looking for water and nutrients don't concentrate at the base of the tree. They're going to be concentrated around the edge of the canopy up to 1/3 of the radius, kind of farther out. So just to keep it super simple, like if you have a 10-foot wide tree, I will do everything underneath the tree and another 3 to 4 feet farther, 3 to 4 feet farther out. And then if you have a wider area, you could keep going. That's great. But that's what I aim for as my minimum. And if you just don't have the ability to do that far, then do what you can. Sometimes there's pavement on one side and you just can't do that. And then another good question when we're on this: how often does one get herbicides mixed in the tree trimmings? Is it okay for a vegetable garden? Good question. So there might be some lawn trimmings in when you get your mixed arborist trimmings, but most of the time it's tree trimmings. It's branches, twigs, tree leaves. And people don't spray herbicide up in trees really. So normally it's going to be pretty clean. And then depending on where things are, there's not a ton of herbicide used these days in most of our neighborhoods in the lawns. So theoretically there can be some, but it's much less of a concern than like some people, not usually in urban areas, but kind of out in more rural areas, will use straw as mulch because it's available, and different pesticides and herbicides accumulating in straw is much more of an issue than it is with our urban kind of tree trimmings. Personally, I've never heard of issues with it. Can't promise that it has never happened, but I've never heard of it happening. And so then last thing, mulch use in vegetable gardens. That's a good transition to our last talking about mulches. So I did mention before that compost can be used as mulch. And this is one case where I do it in my vegetable gardens. I will often, between every season, so in Southern California, I plant in the fall and I plant in the spring. And as I'm kind of retouching my beds each season, I will lay down about 1 inch of compost if I have access to it. If I don't have access to a full inch of compost, I'll lay out what I have. But I top dress with 1 inch of compost, not mixed in, just on the top after my garden beds are already going. And that compost is that mulch layer. Now in the summer, after the crops have started really growing in and the heat is getting going, in most of my beds, we'll also go back and add about 1 inch or so of wood chip mulch after the crops are established, not when they're very little, but after they're getting going, just kind of by hand, do that in. It's great for the soil. It keeps things cooler and it's great for water savings. But what I have had happen with too much wood chip mulch on veggie beds, especially in the winter when things are very moist, which is why I don't mulch with wood chips anymore in the winter, is that it creates great habitat for earwigs and sow bugs. And you'll read some places that earwigs and sow-bugs only eat decomposing organic matter, and they do eat a lot of that, but they will also eat young seedlings. And so I do keep an eye on things. So, once your tomato plants are up and going, not really going to be an issue. So I feel fine putting that wood chip mulch on for those benefits. But if you have, especially with greens, like little seeds coming up in the fall or winter garden, I avoid it because that can sometimes be the case. And so what I do, for example, is at the end of the summer, when I'm ready to top dress with my compost for my winter garden, I will just rake the wood chip mulch lightly so I don't take any of the good soil underneath, but I'll just lightly rake the wood chip mulch out into the pathways in between the vegetable beds, which are covered with wood chip mulch anyways, and they will just touch up, add some mulch to the pathways. I have some raised beds where it's wood chip mulch around it. So I just rake it to the side and then just, knock it out of the bed and use that to touch up the pathways and then go from there. So to transition, many native and Waterwise plants are adapted to our natural soils. Even like locally, Upland and Rancho Cucamonga have very gravelly soil, and Chino Hills tends to have heavier clay soil. But even those clay soil, it's pretty easy, and we have resources with lists of plants that are water-wise and great for clay soil. So if you're selecting your plants well for your soils and your local areas, then you generally don't need to work with any compost for your water-wise garden. I mean, if you have some, you can toss some in. If your soil has been very compacted and you're trying to get the soil life going again, a little bit kind of top dressed before you put down your wood chip mulch could be good. But then beyond that, you generally wouldn't need anything more than like a wood chip mulch. But what happens when we want to grow stuff that isn't really meant to grow here, stuff that doesn't really thrive here without a lot of care? So talking about fruit trees, vegetables, roses, subtropicals. What we want to do is we want to improve our soil as much as possible. We want to raise the water holding capacity as much as possible. We want to make our soil in some ways as rich as possible without just dumping a ton of chemical fertilizer on it. And so then we get a great chance to work with compost, either ordered in or turning a problem, which is food scraps, into a solution, which is beautiful compost, which is the best stuff for improving soil for those plants that want that richer soil. That's really the way to do it. I mentioned that it's turning a problem into a solution because organic waste, basically food scraps, kitchen scraps, going into the waste stream and eventually into the landfills really is an environmental problem. What happens is in those large landfills, our kitchen waste from home starts to break down in anaerobic conditions in those large landfills. And that anaerobic, which means not happening in the presence of oxygen, decomposition creates a lot of methane gas, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide, and contributes to climate change. And across the state is working on new regulations, trying to then work with local jurisdictions, really kind of setting new standards for getting the organics, the food waste out of the waste stream to prevent that. And the best way to do that is to compost it, because composting makes it break down in a different way, an aerobic, an oxygen-rich environment where that methane is not created. And a lot of that carbon is then creating this rich soil, which is then going onto eventually with worms and stuff like that in our garden pulled into the soil, where instead of going into the atmosphere, we are actually putting carbon into the soil where it can benefit our sustainable agriculture and home gardening efforts. So that's part of why compost is magic. And if you are trying to garden with your fruit trees or your roses in something that looks like this as your soil, or heavy clay that looks like this, we want to use this stuff. And so it's 10:30 right now. What we'll do is we'll take just like a 5-minute break. Okay, we are back with adventures from working from home and a cat that just jumped on the keyboard to advance the slides. But let's get back into it, starting with some questions from an anonymous attendee. Is it okay to put mulch against trunks when it is cold? Might depend on where you are. In Southern California, it's not going to get cold enough to justify that. I know I've seen those like volcanoes of mulch in like the Midwest done as insulation. My thought would be if that is going to happen, definitely take it off as soon as you can. It's not something you want to use long term. I'm not so sure about the practice. Yeah, but locally in Southern California, not something that we need to deal with. It does not get that cold for our trees. Okay, from Sharon. I have compost that's at least 10 years old. I got it for free from my city. I stored it covered in a large trash can. It's now dry, dusty like gravel. Is it still good when I put it in the vegetable garden? Meaning, will the microorganisms come alive when you start watering it in? At this point, those microorganisms, I mean, there's going to be some bacteria and things like that that are just on everything, but it's not going to have the benefits of like good, properly aged, but kind of fresh compost. Kind of after compost is completed, you really want to use it in 6 months to a year while maintaining that nice moisture level. So it's kind of ideal moisture level is kind of like a wrung out sponge where if you squeeze it, it maybe get like 1 drop of water out of it, which is normally if you get it from the city or in bulk, it's already drier than that. But that's really how you're going to get your multiple benefits. That's going to, what you have is still going to be like a coarse organic matter. It won't be bad other than the fact that it might be what's called hydrophobic, where it's so dry that if you lay it like on top of the soil, you would like the water won't even soak in. So probably what I would do is just kind of mix it in if you have fruit trees or anything like that, just generally here and there around. But it's not going to be the great stuff for your garden. It's kind of too old and dried out for that. Another question that just came in from Kat. How much water runoff do you get with areas of gravel, like the person's picture who did it right? That's going to be based on your underlying soil and your slope and all of those things. So it's going to be, generally, I would say it's going to be slightly less than it would be just like what absorbs into the soil naturally. So if you have well-draining soil and not a lot of slope, little to no runoff. But if you have a sloped area and kind of heavier clay soil, you'll get probably slightly less runoff than you would otherwise. So like that example, that picture happened to be in Rancho Cucamonga, an area that has pretty gravelly soils naturally. That person's not going to be getting any runoff. So the gravel, because the water just kind of goes off the gravel the gravel doesn't block the water. It's quite permeable. And the reason why I said slightly less runoff is because the water having to move in between all of that gravel as it travels slows it down just a little bit. It would also prevent any erosion from happening if the water does run off. And that slowing it down just gives the soil a little bit more time to have a chance of absorbing that water. So a couple of questions that came in on the chat as well from Elaine. Will the webinar be available for later view? Yes, it will. So this is being recorded, and after some light editing for the downtime, like the breaks, sometime next week, it'll get posted to our YouTube channel, and have a quick link that will get you directly to the workshop section, and that's cbwcd.org/YouTube. Will get you right to our workshop, so it'll be there. And then from Gloria, that is from Gloria. That is a irrigation for fruit trees question. So if you're around at the end of the workshop, Gloria, we can talk, and I can answer that question for you. And then Josephina, have not forgotten about the benefits of compost for clay soil question, but we are about to start getting into all of that right now. And so compost, there's basically 2 things that are fueling why compost is going to help us in our gardens that we want to enrich the soil. The first is the addition of organic matter to the soil. And especially in Southern California, in drier areas and in areas that are less traditionally covered with like forest or dense grasslands, our soils in our area tend to have pretty good nutrients a lot of the time, a little bit low in nitrogen, but they have low organic matter. So adding that organic matter can be really helpful. And we'll talk a little bit about why more. And it also, if it's produced well, can add beneficial soil biology. And we'll talk a little bit about well-produced compost. But first, what is compost? Here's an example of compost from my home compost pile on the right. Compost is fully decomposed organic matter is one of the things that would truly define something as compost. And by fully decomposed, what I mean is if you look at this picture on the right, other than maybe like a couple of little grains of sand that got in there and a couple of twigs, it's fully broken down. I mean, you can't tell what the original ingredients were. You can't look at it and say, well, that part was a banana peel and that part was a citrus peel and that part was a leaf and that part was a wood chip. It's fully broken down, gone through that process of being decomposed by microorganisms. Usually compost will originate from a mixture of woody material and a nitrogen containing material. And the woody material has carbon, the nitrogen containing material has nitrogen, and those are the two things that the microorganisms that fuel the composting process put together to then make everything happen. And so those are kind of like the food inputs for the microorganisms, is a nice simple way to think about it. The nitrogen containing material is for a home compost pile is often vegetables. Can be some like fresh leaves, lawn clippings are a nitrogen material, and manures as well. And oftentimes, the manures in a large kind of commercially produced compost pile, they'll use manures from farm operations. And if it's produced well, it's loaded with life. There's lots of things that are sold as compost. I have in Southern California looked at a lot of those things sold commercially as compost underneath a microscope to evaluate the soil biology in that. And what I have found is that all of the bulk produced, order it by the yard or by the ton from the soil yard products, or even the stuff available real locally and easily, commonly in nurseries and big box hardware stores, you just really don't see great living soil biology in them. Very different than the benefits of the great soil biology you can produce and add in with a well-maintained home compost pile. Depending on where you are, that might be different. I know that there are large commercial operations being done by people who really know their stuff in other parts of the country. I've read, kind of seen videos about them, but just the stuff that I've personally tested in Southern California that's been available in the places where I've been doing projects, bringing in lots of stuff, at a time when I was really trying to find good stuff to bring in bulk, didn't really find anything. So the stuff that I brought in being called compost for those projects was soil amendment, but it just didn't have that biological activity in true great compost. So why do we want compost? Compost is a great soil amendment, as I mentioned, for plants that like those richer soil conditions. And it helps build soil for what you might call tricky soils. And usually that's going to be either heavy clay or very like excessively sandy or drained soils like decomposed granite, gravelly, very rocky, or soil that has been compacted by lots of heavy equipment on it, or planting a garden where somebody, parked a car for a long time on top of dirt. Something that used to be like our dirt road or something like that. Something that used to be, a parking lot under pavement. I've worked on all of those kinds of projects and worked with compost and organic matter to help reclaim those soils. The soil structure benefits okay, so sorry, I was kind of reading that wrong from my notes. The soil structure becomes greatly improved after using compost for a while, and also the chemical properties of that soil amended with compost can help hold nutrients and water better. So it's working on a bunch of different levels. And the science in this is fascinating, goes beyond what we will cover here. But again, there's some great books, really cool videos looking at soil microbiology and structure on YouTube if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But we'll look at just a couple of pictures soon that will kind of illustrate that. But there's physical, there's chemical, and there's biological benefits. And it's interesting that this same stuff will work in clay soil, both to help loosen and improve the infiltration rate of that soil by improving its structure, by creating more pathways through that clay soil, which has poor infiltration rates, because it becomes waterlogged because the soil particles are so tiny, and so the water can't get through. By creating better structure, there's more pore spaces, there's room for air and water to get through. That same material, when added to soils that are overly sandy or gravelly, can create structure that will better hold onto water. It works on both extremes, which is pretty cool, especially because we can make it in our backyards. It can also help reactivate beneficial soil life and the soil food web. And so some of it is that compost you make itself will be covered in what's usually mostly beneficial soil life, but also by putting that organic matter into the soil, raising the percentage of organic matter in the soil, providing for that structure in the soil. That creates basically a better habitat for the beneficial soil life, allows it to expand, to populate, to kind of re-enrich the soil. And that soil food web is really important. Another fascinating thing that we're just going to scrape the surface of. But that soil food web does a number of things, one of which is, in general, a healthy soil food web will help protect your plants from pests and diseases. And then another thing is that in what you might call an organic system, and that's everything, anything that's not being fed with chemical soil. So that's everything from the organic vegetable garden to like how the wild world works in terms of growing a forest. Nutrients go from their raw forms cycling, like fallen leaves or animal carcasses breaking down if you're out in the forest or something like that. They only cycle around to become plant available nutrients as they are processed through the soil food web. So an active, healthy soil food web means through natural conditions, your plants can have potentially access to those available nutrients. And so if you're doing organic gardening at home using organic fertilizers, which is always what I recommend for homeowners for a variety of different reasons, covered in different class, that soil food web is what's processing those inputs and turning it into plant available nutrients in many cases. There's a little bit of stuff that might be readily available, but a lot of it has to go through that cycle. That cycle happens over quite a while. And so that's why if you hear about organic fertilizers kind of being slow release or sustained release of nutrients, that's because it's taking a while for that soil food web to over time kind of work away at that stuff, as opposed to one of the issues with the chemical fertilizers is that it's too much. And then if it rains, it washes away and causes pollution, because that's just that raw available chemical right away. Really easy to go overboard with that. And then finally, helps turn that waste into a resource as it sequesters the carbon in the soil. And so we're going to be looking at a lot of pictures soon, but this is sort of that foundational stuff that's really important for us to get through. General types of compost. If you're trying to have the best stuff, that's going to be either you're making it yourself at home usually, or getting some from a friend who makes it or someone Again, in other states, other areas, I've seen and heard of really high quality, biologically active compost being created. I'm not aware of anything that you can buy as a commercial product, right off the shelf that really has all of those best benefits in Southern California. You can get stuff that's labeled as compost that's mass produced and bagged, sometimes at nurseries, sometimes at big box hardware stores. Compost can mean many different things. Usually, compared to that compost that I showed that's fully broken down, which is part of what I use as my definition of compost, most of those bagged products are not going to be sufficiently broken down. They still might act as good soil amendments, depending on what products your local sources carry. And for me, I have a pretty big vegetable garden at home. My compost piles at home do take care of that waste to resource, They process all of my vegetable kitchen waste, some of my yard waste as well, make great stuff to go into the beds. But I'm never going to produce enough compost at home to cover all of my compost needs and wants for my vegetable bed. So I am bringing in other sources. So sometimes I have used this stuff that's either mass produced or bagged. I know that all of the biology isn't there, but it is high quality organic matter that I can add in to enrich my beds. And then I'm using just a little bit of my precious homemade compost kind of here or there as kind of like a probiotic in different parts of my garden, mixed in or top dressed, depending on what I'm doing, in conjunction with that more bulk product. So in addition to the bag stuff, there's mass-produced bulk materials that you would purchase from landscape materials or soils yards. So I'm saying in Southern California, like I mentioned, I've looked at a lot of this stuff under the microscope, and I've never found what I consider that true, fully broken down, biologically active compost. It's really, really hard to do that on a large scale, usually done in kind of a dusty, open area underneath full sun in Southern California. It's a lot easier to do it in a wetter area like the Pacific Northwest. What is sold is sometimes helpful as a soil amendment, though I have sometimes brought stuff in and found it kind of like a mixture of finely ground wood chips with lots of like unbroken down manure in it. So I always encourage people, like what you get from different sources can be very different. Look at or get a sample before ordering like a huge amount for a large project, or look at it in person if you're going to be picking it up as the truckload. And then finally, there's mass produced with biosolids, and that is usually from like a regional plant. So the stuff where we are, there is a huge regional plant in Rancho Cucamonga that is in a very regulated process with all sorts of sensors and people who really know their stuff. I've talked to them. I've gone on a tour of their facility, creating compost, mixing basically usually like wood chips, shredded arborist trimmings as the carbon, and then biosolids, which are the basically highly already processed sewage sludge, which has been essentially sterilized through its pre-processing, and then mixing that together to produce a compost. Now, the quality might vary depending on the site and production, so I can mostly speak from experience with our local plant, which basically takes the biosolids from part of Los Angeles County and from part of San Bernardino County and mixes it with those trimmings. Our locally produced material is made by the Inland Empire Regional Composting Authority. And even though it does contain those sewage solids, which a lot of people kind of, there's an ick factor with it. And definitely I had that for a while. I had seen how many gardens have just thrived using this stuff, went on the tour, talked to the person who's producing it, looked at some of their soil test stuff. And now this is what I actually use in my yard to supplement my homegrown compost. And it's been working really well for me. To be quite honest, I use it on my vegetables and my fruit trees. When I first started using it, at first I was only comfortable on my fruit trees, but now I feel completely comfortable with it. And I find that because it is such a regulated process, it's actually produced indoors in what was a huge old IKEA factory with just like extremely accurate attention paid to moisture levels, to composting. There's a lot of regulations that they need to follow. It's approved for agricultural use. So most of the output is used on farms. I find that it actually, the qualities of it in terms of moisture holding capacity, really picking up moisture really well and improving the soil, outperforms most of the bulk compost that I've used in the past. In fact, it's the best industrial kind of large scale stuff that I feel like I've used. And that is the stuff that's given away in our free compost program. So it does contain the biosolids. I want to be upfront about it because some people are uncomfortable with it. I use it in my home garden and it's been doing really well for me. And it's been free. The price is right. And there's not a bunch of plastic bags to throw out. So things like this, depending on your situation, might be helpful as soil amendments, but they're not quite compost, even though they say they are. Also not quite compost, but in a bagged product that you can get at a nursery. I normally don't like to recommend certain brands, but if you just go to, I don't think you can get at Home Depot, but like local nurseries, Armstrong Garden Center, if I don't have access to real compost and I'm looking for like something really, really nice to get a couple of raised beds going, it's relatively expensive. So, if you have 1,000 square feet of planting space, it's not going to be economically viable. When I put in a single raised bed for my parents, I got 2 or 3 bags of this stuff to mix in with their normal just soil. I had extra soil from digging various parts of the yard. And this stuff I have had really good experience with as a soil amendment. You can see it's more broken down than most of what you will find from these bagged products. It also contains some beneficial soil microbes mixed in, and has a good nutrient kind of analysis. This is also what I use like when I'm producing my own vegetable starts in like little pods, and then 4-inch pots. I use this stuff as well. So I end up buying a few bags of this every year for various things in the garden. These days, I don't use it in my beds, but have in the past. And you can see here, it looks a little bit drier, and you can see a little bit less fully broken down compared to like this being the real stuff. And in your homegrown stuff, there'll always be, if you're putting wood chips or something in, a few pieces, and then just depending on how much you screen it out is kind of how clean it's going to be in the long run. So what I do is I screen it, and a few small pieces get in. There's always some larger chunks of wood chips as well, but that stuff, as I screen it out, I have that stuff left, and that stuff is literally kind of covered in very active, good soil microbiology. I toss that in the new compost pile as kind of an inoculant, and it might break down the second time around. If it's a really stubborn piece of wood, it might take another time around, but you don't end up with too much of it. It just goes back in the compost pile, or you can just add it to your mulch underneath fruit trees or whatever else. And you can see in here this little kind of white strands you will see in decent compost, depending on the stage, sometimes more or less. These little white strands, those are strands of what are most likely saprophytic fungus, which is the fungus that goes to work breaking down woody materials. Some of the compounds in the wood need to be broken down by fungus before then the bacteria, nematodes, and other parts in that soil food web can go to it. So there's all sorts of different microbiology, and each kind of member of that soil food web has a role to play in the order of decompositional breakdown. It's really fascinating. And so having that good active soil food web with the compost, or encouraged by the compost, in your gardens can do a number of different things. So this is just one example of one of the relationships going on in healthy soil. So it's not necessarily specific to your compost pile, but by adding organic matter in our soils, having that really dynamic soil ecosystem. So this worm-looking thing is it's a pathogenic nematode, causes plant disease. And nematodes, there's good guy nematodes and bad guy nematodes. This happens to be one that we'd rather not have in our garden. This is a scanning electron microscope image, and it's caught in a trap. And so this strand is a fungal hyphae. So this is part of a beneficial fungal organism, and it has these rings which somehow attract the nematode through some chemical process. And as the nematode goes in, those rings inflate, they trap it, and then the fungus breaks down that nematode. It's kind of niche. And so what happens is, in a healthy soil food web environment, this is just one example of this fascinating war zone that's going on in between all these microorganisms. And it just happens with the kind of evolutionary balance of the wild world, that the more active this zone is, the good guys are going to tend to outweigh the bad guys. And one of the problems with chemical agriculture, or too much chemical fertilizer over too long, is that the various chemical compositions kind of break down this whole system, and the bad guys often come back faster than the good guys. So by having this dynamic organic system, it's essentially a probiotic system that's helping our plants out. here's another example of healthy soil conditions. This is a photograph showing the mycorrhizal fungal interaction of a young pine seedling. So 90% of our terrestrial plants have mycorrhizal interactions, which means that they have evolved to have a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship with different fungal species in the soil. And those fungal species, depending on the species, depending on the plant and the adaptation, basically attach to the roots of the plant in different ways and literally act as an extended root zone. So on the left, you see like the actual root of the plant at this stage. And on the right, you see the plant with its ideal beneficial mycorrhizal relationship. So really multiplying the ability of the plant to gather nutrients and moisture. It's almost hard to believe when you first start reading about this stuff. It is amazing. And these networks can actually, like in a pine forest, these networks would connect and would actually share potentially nutrients, moisture, as well as chemical signals that stimulate production of different compounds within the plants, not just over one species, but sometimes can do it across multiple species. So it's really quite amazing. And it works as a beneficial relationship because it helps gather nutrients and moisture that the plant might not be able to otherwise. But one thing that this fungus cannot produce for itself, stuck under the ground, are sugars, which the plants that have these relationships can. When they do their thing with photosynthesis, they're producing sugars. And so they will put a portion of what they produce through photosynthesis into growing, but will share a portion through exuding it in their root zone with these beneficial relationships. And so that's just one example of what we can cultivate in a healthy soil food web system. So this stuff is because it grows on the roots of plants. Like these plants aren't directly going to necessarily be in our compost pile, but having good organic matter and good soil structure makes it a better environment for these relationships to grow. And if you have halfway decent soil, these plants will be there. I mean, these fungal species will be there. The beneficial bacteria will be there. However, if you're starting out on really, really poor soil that's been abused, very dried out over time, you will see that a lot of the organic fertilizer products, especially the higher end ones, and even like that green sack of the Dr. Earth homegrown amendment that I showed you, will have some of those beneficial microorganisms in them to re-inoculate the soil. There's a lot of products that will claim that they have that stuff mixed in. The high quality products will actually tell you how many organisms per application are in there. So that's one way. And then if you're buying that stuff, picking it up at the nursery, make sure you're getting a box or a bag that's been in the shade. You'd never want to have something that's been like baking out in the full sun. That's not good for the living stuff inside. And so if you look at just a little bit of healthy soil structure up close, so the kind of structure that in our local soils is encouraged by the addition of compost, this is actually what you might see. In good, healthy soil, only about 50%, 60% the actual mineral soil, and about 40 to 50% of that soil volume will actually be these open spaces in between. And those open spaces are places for water, places for air, because our roots of our soils actually need air. If everything's waterlogged, it becomes an anaerobic situation, which causes a lot of pathogens. Our plants' roots can't actually breathe, all sorts of problems. So that structure, so that when it does rain, can hold on to the right amount of water, but also let air come back into the root zone, is critical. And that's also the space where there's all sorts of, you can see little fungal threads in here. There's bacteria and nematodes and amoebas, all kind of competing, eating each other. And then their poop is essentially what are the plant available nutrients after it's been processed. And so some of the, especially the fungus and the bacteria, will break down the organics that are going in, some of the stuff in the compost, just, natural like roots of plants growing and dying back and regrowing. And then other critters will eat those. And then eventually that comes to the plant available form. And so our soils that are very poor in organic matter aren't as good as creating this crumb structure that has the spaces in between. That's created when largely bacteria is doing the work of organizing this combination of organic matter and then the mineral soil structure. And so that's why having that organic matter and that beneficial compost can really help create structure in soils that are poor in organic matter, as just a simple way to put it. And so that's how, that structural creation, creating those niches that then have that structure where the water and the air can go through, that is how that compost is able to both improve sandy soil and clay soil at the same time. And all of this, just been studied by soil scientists, and you can see this is like a flow chart of all of the interactions of who's eating what in the soil food web. You don't need to understand all of this. There won't be a test at the end, but by having a great environment in our vegetable beds and our orchards through working with our compost and our mulches, we facilitate all of this happening, which means less disease and more biologically available nutrients for our plants. So that's kind of as far as we'll get into the science, but if you're interested in it, learn more. It's fascinating. So let's jump to getting really practical in terms of recommendations for the uses of compost, how it's made. We will look as we start our last hour of the class at like different compost bins and systems you can buy, the ones I recommend, the ones I don't. And then we'll end with what I've actually found as the most practical approaches to home composting and worm composting. So uses of compost. I will use compost, or sometimes if I need to get a lot of it, that bulk like semi-compost soil amendment, very differently. My first season, if I'm setting up like a new vegetable bed, whether it's in the ground or a raised bed, then I will use it in subsequent seasons. The first season is all about just a big jumpstart on getting things going. Normally, in most cases, if someone's doing a front yard or a backyard vegetable garden, it's soil that hasn't been doing that for a while. Oftentimes it's dry and dusty. Sometimes it was underneath the lawn. If the soil has been underneath the lawn, actually, sometimes the organic matter percentage is not that bad because there's been roots growing and dying back for a long time. But the first season, my goal is to put down really as much compost as I can and mix that into the soil about a foot deep using either a digging fork or a shovel, because I want to get that organic matter with the beneficial soil biology, whatever I can get in, as evenly applied through that foot of soil, which is going to be the main root zone of a lot of our vegetables. Some of them will go deeper, evenly distributed. That's going to be my one chance to do that. I'm going to be assuming in most of our urban areas that the soil biology and the soil structure is not that great through that foot. And I want to jumpstart that by mixing that compost and organic matter in that foot deep the first time. I'm only going to do that first time, because once that soil food web gets going, if you dig in and start moving around all the soil and flipping things upside down and busting it apart, you're going to disrupt all of that. And a lot of those beneficial soil microorganisms are either pretty sensitive to how far down from the top of the soil they are, or that fungus that we saw, those long kind of strands of that continual network. You'll shred all of that if you start moving things all around. And so you might have heard the term no dig gardening. So in my first season, I will put down 1 inch to 4 inches of compost, 1 inch being the minimum I aim for, 4 inches being awesome if you can get that much material. But often I can't. It just depends on the budget and the logistics of the project. So I've done 4 inches and it's worked great. My current place where I'm living in my backyard, big garden, small budget, did about 1 inch for the first year with that technique, and it's still going very well. After that first year, I will apply compost, usually every season, to my vegetable beds. And in Southern California, I consider us to have 2 main veggie seasons, fall planting and spring planting. And I will top dress with 1/2 inch to 1 inch of compost, if I can, as close as I can get to it, just depending on how much I have. And I will do that with just laying out, like almost as a mulch, up to 1 inch of compost or that as close as possible to compost soil amendment on top of my beds, that twice a year. And what I will do is, so for me, that top dressing is normally going to be, I can't produce for the size of my vegetable garden. It's a pretty big vegetable garden, all that compost at home. So that bulk top dressing, I will use with the compost that we give away for free at our program with the Waterwise Community Center. And I will also, every once in a while, once a year to once every 2 years, if I have access to it, top dress with some compost underneath my fruit trees, just as a little boost. And if it's a mulched area, you can just put it right on top of the mulch because it's all going to break down and mix together eventually. And then certain garden perennials, if they're things that's subtropicals, things that want a little bit more nutrients, certainly not my California native plants or most of my Mediterranean plants, you can top dress with 1 inch of compost, again, just right on the surface, kind of underneath the plant, but just like mulch, not right up against the stem or main trunk of the plant. Now, with my homemade compost, if I just had, a few, probably 1 to 4 raised vegetable beds, I might be able to produce enough compost at home to meet all those compost needs. But I have 4 raised vegetable beds and a bunch of in the ground beds. And so what I normally do is, with my good biology, really nicely structured, precious homemade compost, is I'll consider that to be like a probiotic for my soil. And I will mix small amounts, either handfuls or light dusting of it here and there throughout my garden. Oftentimes I'll lay that down like right before I put my bulk compost on top of it, because I don't want to do just a small layer and leave that baking in the sun right in the top. Sometimes I'll even literally go around and bury small handfuls here and there, using that precious stuff, introducing it like those probiotics into the environment, and then having the broadened stuff be my bulk organic matter that I'm trying to keep going. And what will happen is that if you add in 1 inch, once your vegetable garden is really going, oftentimes worms will show up. There's that active soil food web. And especially with the worms, like that stuff will get integrated down into the soil through natural processes. You don't want to dig it in and disturb everything, but it will just absorb. So that 6 months later, when I'm doing my next planting, there's a little bit of it on the top, but I don't have even close to a 1 inch layer anymore. It's been absorbed into the soil through the natural processes. And then if you have general plantings, but again, have that very gravelly soil or heavy clay soil, and you're doing a big project, you might top dress with some compost as well. I don't bother in like general landscape areas mixing it in. Again, that mixing will happen over time. And generally, I find in most cases, with exceptions, most of the time, once you start getting heavy equipment out to mix things in, you're often doing more damage than benefits. I just layer, that stuff on the top underneath your mulch layer. And so those are my general guidelines for compost use. So how is it made? Essentially, what compost is it's just the natural aerobic. So in the presence of oxygen, like I mentioned, in the landfill, it becomes anaerobic, which is not as beneficial. It's the natural aerobic decomposition of organic matter into what's sometimes referred to as humus, kind of the final, fully broken down, nicely structured stuff. In general, like if we just dumped our kitchen scraps in the backyard, maybe there is some wood chips or fallen branches around or whatever, and we weren't concerned about rodents and all of the other problems that it would cause, eventually it would happen automatically. But that's not how we want to live. And it's not controlled, and it doesn't necessarily have a nice final product because we're not getting the mix of the carbon and nitrogen stuff in the exact right way that we would want it for the best final product. So we control the process of that aerobic decomposition to ensure that nice final product, to make sure that it doesn't smell bad, to make it less attractive to critters, often rodents, and to make it happen in a compact and relatively contained space. So basically, best output and as backyard friendly as possible. And here is, I think, in terms of composting for what you might do if you want to compost at home, this is going to be the most essential information I can offer you. And this is kind of where I have landed after doing this and traveling around and looking what other people do. Kind of sums up a lot of work and thought. If you read about composting, if you look at stuff online, most of what you will read about is what's called hot composting. That's getting all your ingredients together, very careful mix of your greens and brown products, and trying to get it to where basically it reaches through the decomposition process, all those microorganisms, where it gets to at least 140 degrees, but below 160 degrees for a somewhat extended amount of time. Hot composting, or often what people talk about when they're talking about composting. If you have a farm, that's great. If you are composting as your number one hobby and working on getting material from all around town and driving to coffee shops and getting their coffee grounds and hitting up the local farm for manure or the stable, that's great. For most homeowners, for the average or even pretty avid gardener who is more excited about gardening than composting, but also wants to compost for the environmental and garden benefits, it is almost impossible to consistently do hot composting well if you're doing it casually at the home scale. That is just the fact. The main reason is that to initiate that sustained temperature that you need to keep, you generally need at least a cubic yard of material all at once as you build your compost, about 50% of that being your brown carbon material, about 50% of it being your green nitrogen material. And we'll talk a little bit more about greens and browns to make sure that that's clear. The carbon material, you can use that wood chip mulch. I use the wood chip mulch that we give away for free at the Waterwise Community Center. It works great. That's easy to get hold of. But the nitrogen material, for most of us, that's our kitchen scraps. To put it in context, I have a Toyota Tacoma pickup truck. My 6-foot bed of my truck, filled evenly to the top, is just about a cubic yard of material. So to have half of that of the nitrogen stuff, the kitchen scraps, or manure from local farms or things like that, all at once is a whole lot of work. It's not something I'm interested in even trying to do. My kitchen, we garden, we cook a lot. We have our cuttings from all the outer leaves and all that stuff, the veggies we harvest. We wouldn't even get close to that. We cannot do hot composting unless we're driving all around town, picking up ingredients, trying to find things. And all of that driving is going to more than outweigh, just with all the gasoline, the environmental benefits of composting anyways. To do hot composting well, it requires careful temperature monitoring, like with a compost thermometer. And then if the pile, even if your ingredients are perfect, when the pile starts getting too high or too low, and you're monitoring the temperature, you need to essentially stop what you're doing either that day or pretty close to it, and then turn that whole pile, which means you need space to turn it into, and it's a lot of physical work. It requires that careful balance of inputs, and moisture is also really important. Not what most people are going to successfully do at home. I know a lot of people who have gotten frustrated trying to do it at home. I honestly don't even think it's worth it. It does make good compost quality quickly. It was definitely faster than the cool composting that I do at home and I'm going to recommend to all of you. And that high temperature does have the benefit that it will kill weed seeds and it will kill most soil pathogens. However, if you don't do it well, it can also get too hot. It can go anaerobic because there's not enough oxygen if you're not turning it enough. And if it goes anaerobic, you have all sorts of other problems and you don't have that high quality compost. So what I recommend is cool composting. It's what's going to work best for most of us. It works really well. It's what I use to produce that beautiful, handful of compost I had in the picture that we talked about. Worm composting is a kind of cool compost. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But cool compost is essentially a laid back way of composting where you can use your kitchen scraps as they're available, a little bit at a time, whatever your kitchen produces, weeds from your garden as long as they haven't gone to seed. And if you want to do a few other like trimmings from your yard, as long as you chop them up, as long as they're not diseased, that's great too. So that's what I do at home. And it's really much more forgiving ingredient balance. I'll show you my whole system for doing it. It makes it really easy to make sure I get my greens and my browns correctly. It's a no-turn system, pretty much. You never need to turn the whole pile. Just as you add new stuff in, I kind of mix those greens and the browns together. And if you really want to, even that can be optional. So it's a lot less time, a lot less work. Because it's not getting as hot, over time, worms have showed up in my compost pile. So I don't even keep a separate worm bin anymore because I just have worms in that area. When I dig into my compost as it's going, there's just worms all over the place. It's become its own kind of natural worm bin. Disadvantage is that it does take longer to produce the compost, but for me, that's fine. I have 2 bins and one bin is going to be ready each time. It's on a schedule. One bin is going to be ready for my amending for my spring planting, one for my fall planting. It doesn't kill weed seeds. So if my weed plants have gone to seed, I put those in the green bin, and it doesn't kill pathogens. So the only thing that means for me is that some of my vegetable plants that tend to be more prone to disease. So for me, that's like tomatoes, that's garlic, and that's peppers. Even if they're not diseased, and eggplants as well, even if they're not diseased, I will put those in the green bin when they come out instead of the compost. In reality, by the time my healthy, tomato plants growing in this great soil, they'll be 8 feet plus tall, are coming out. There's so much material and the stems are so thick. I don't run like a shredder or a grinder at home. It would be a ton of work to cut those up anyways. So I often am going to want to green bin it anyways. But a lot of the other stuff that comes out does make its way into the compost pile. And so that's cool compost. I'll explain to you the whole system, but I find that works much better for most of us. So we're going to get a little bit more into greens and browns. There is some text just to go over all of these things, and then we'll look at step-by-step pictures of the systems. So balance of greens and browns in terms of the inputs. And that's a simple way of saying greens are things that are going to have that nitrogen component that you need for your compost pile. Browns are going to have that carbon component that you need for your compost pile. So your common green or nitrogen inputs for home composting: vegetable scraps, lawn trimmings, and if you have farm animal manures, not dog and cat, not human, but farm animals. They don't have the kind of pathogens that are really hard for us to deal with and might make us sick. And then green leaves to some degree as well. Lawn trimmings are very high in nitrogen and tend to get, like if you just have a big pile of lawn trimmings, like waiting to put in your compost, they can start to get kind of sludgy and nasty and just kind of anaerobically decompose by themselves. So if you're going to use some, fine, but mix that with some of your wood chips, get it into the pile pretty quickly when you're done. Don't leave it sitting there. And if you're doing lawn trimmings with this cool pile, make sure if your lawn has Bermuda grass in it that there's no Bermuda grass seeds. Bermuda grass is super tough, and even most people who think they're doing hot hot composting, they could end up with Bermuda grass all over their compost pile. So if you have Bermuda grass in your lawn, you might just want to green bin it and not even mess with potentially getting Bermuda grass into your veggie beds. Common carbon inputs, those wood chips and arborist trimmings, those are really going to be your best thing in an urban area. Straw in a more rural area where it's available works as well. Not hay. Hay actually has the seed, which is that nutritious grain for like the animals that eat hay. That is high in nitrogen, so it's not going to be that high carbon. With straw, however, depending on how the straw is produced, if it's not produced organically, certain people have had a lot of issues with some of the chemicals, herbicides, pesticides on the straw. So know where your straw is coming from. Make sure it's clean if you're going to put it into your compost pile. Definitely have heard of composted straw with certain herbicides in it that the straw plants or the plants that produce the straw were fine with, but then causing problems later on in vegetable beds. To keep it simple, for general composting, but especially for our cool composting, if you aim for 50% by volume, high carbon stuff and high nitrogen stuff, you're going to be doing well. And so for me, that's 50% of the wood chips that we give away for free at the Waterwise Community Center, and 50% mostly my kitchen scraps with some other scraps from my garden. What to avoid? Avoid meat, oil, and generally dairy. Meat, I make sure doesn't go into my compost pile. Oil, if it's just like some leftovers that didn't get eaten in the fridge and there was olive oil and stuff, in it, that's fine. But in general, I wouldn't pour out oil and vinegar salad dressing into the compost pile. Something, like super oily, like grease from, the skillet or something like that. I put those in a separate oil container, which is eventually, goes sealed into the trash. And generally dairy, like a small bit of cheese on a plate, or if there's like a little bit of cheese mixed in a dish where I'm dumping like old leftovers, not a problem. But like if a whole hunk of cheese has gone moldy in the fridge, I'll put that out into the trash. If you have chickens or rabbits, or if you have a friend, their poop is good. Rabbit poop is awesome stuff. Chicken poop is very high in nitrogen. So again, you're going to want to make sure like the lawn clippings that you get that kind of balanced, but not human, cat, or dog poop. I mean, you will find if you research online, like systems that are highly regulated get really hot where people are doing that stuff, usually out in rural areas. What I'm talking about is average person backyard compost and general recommendations for what's going to work for most of us. And so an important thing that, especially for backyard composting, if you don't have a farm or a back, couple of acres, is how are you going to contain your pile? And so I think we've seen some questions coming about what we just talked about. I'll hit up some questions, and then we will transition to piles and containers, and then transition to the technique I recommend. So Margaret, can dried leaves be brown material? I wish the answer was super simple. I will say in general, yes. Some people consider dried leaves to be a nitrogen material. It's kind of in the middle. If it's dried tree leaves, fallen tree leaves, you can consider it to be carbon. It's not going to have as much carbon in it as like the wood chip part. So you might not want to use it as your only carbon source, but to mix in as part of it would be just fine. And people who are really into their hot composting, I mean, you could look at reference charts of the carbon to nitrogen ratio of each of the different inputs and try to balance it out. One of the reasons why I like the cool compost pile is you don't need to worry about that. So I would say, if dried leaves is completely just what you have access to, go for it and try it. But if it seems like things are maybe a little smelly, maybe a little too moist, try to add in some of that wood chip material for more carbon. Can well-aged sheep poop be used as composting? From Georgia? First person I've talked to has access to sheep poop. Normally, farm animals, so sheep included, kind of basically ruminants who eat grasses, are normally, considered good for composting, especially if it's well aged, which helps get rid of some of the potential salinity issues. I've never read anything specifically about sheep, but kind of within the framework of what I know, it should probably be okay. You might do some more specific research, but I think probably if you are doing farm animals as well, if those animals for whatever reason have been on antibiotics lately, you don't want to use their manure until after that's been flushed out of their system, because this whole process is being done by biology, and some of those antibiotics can still be in their poop. And that's part of why like horse manure is often used from stables, because most of the time, as long as the horses are healthy, they're not going to be regularly on antibiotic. Where like from large scale cattle operations, where there's more regular antibiotic use, it's not going to be used as much. Can you use well-boiled chicken bones in a compost pile after making stock? I would not. My partner makes stock at home. We put them in the trash afterwards. I think even though they're well boiled, it's still going to attract some attention from probably raccoons, maybe rats, and as well in a home compost pile, you're not going to get the heat to break it down. In a large scale industrial compost pile, it actually will, but that's not what we're going to really be achieving at home. And you have to be a lot more careful about various issues. So live near LAX. What compost would I recommend as top dressing? So if you have a small yard, small vegetable beds, I have used that green Dr. Earth Homegrown. It works very well. It's more expensive. When I've been more limited on budget and I've had projects where it needs to be some bag thing from the hardware store, you can often get at the big box stores from Kellogg brand. There is a like soil amendment product that comes in the 3 cubic foot kind of rectangular bales, which I've used with mixed success. And then if you have a larger yard or access to a pickup truck, you can look up near you the landscape materials yards, call around, see if they sell soil amendments or compost, and drive down there and take a look at it. Usually you can, if you go down there and want to look at it before you're buying it, they'll let you go to where their big bin of it is and see if it's fully broken down, smell it, see if it smells funky. If it smells, usually you won't get that good compost has that great like forest floor kind of leaf litter decomposing smell. I've never found bulk compost that smells that way, or even bag compost that smells that way. But you can at least smell it and make sure it smells neutral, and that it doesn't smell like funky, like it's stinky anaerobic stuff. And if you do all of that, you might be able to get something. If you can find it somewhere bulk, even if you're only getting a relatively small amount, it's going to be a lot cheaper than buying the bag stuff at the hardware store normally. And then from Mark, yes, we're about to get into the different systems and containers for compost right now. So from Renee, so does that mean that those weed seeds will grow in planter beds and pathogens could be put in planter beds? So that's why. So if you were putting weeds that have gone to seed in your cool compost pile and diseased plants in your cool compost pile, then in theory, yes, which is why for the average homeowner, weeds that have gone to seed, I say just don't compost, and diseased plants, I say just don't compost. Those can all go in the green bin where they're being industrially processed. The reality is that most home composters, even enthusiasts that think they're doing hot composting, taking care of all of those disease and weed issues, are actually not doing it well enough. They're not really hitting the temperatures, the turning that it really takes to deal with those issues. So even though they think they're hot composting, because they're putting all that stuff in, they are actually causing all of those problems back into their vegetable beds. I've seen it happen. And so I'd rather just say, if it's going to be really difficult, unless composting is going to be your hobby, don't bother for the hot compost. Don't even try to compost. the weed seeds or the stuff with pathogens in it, put it in the green bin. Someone just asked, and then we're going to get started on the containers. Last question for now. Since oleanders are poisonous, should we avoid using their leaves in the compost pile? Good question. Since I don't know the answer to that, and since oleander is so poisonous, I will say I don't know. Something worth looking into. So compost piles and containers. Here's the thing at the end of the day. For the most part, the compost, as long as you have the right mix of materials, the right moisture level, the compost is going to do its thing. The microorganisms are doing the work, and they don't care what they're in or if they're just in a pile. The inputs and the moisture, like their home needs, are taken care of. It's really for our convenience, and in the typical, backyard composting situation, it's going down to how neat and enclosed you want it or need it to be, what sort of pest pressure, whether that's like raccoons or rats, you have in your neighborhood, so how closed it needs to be. And because it is so hot and so dry, especially in inland Southern California in the summer, having it being a little bit more enclosed also is less evaporative surface area, can help you keep it a little bit more moist if you need that. So we're going to look at a few different systems right now. And again, I normally try to avoid recommending any one company. However, this happens to be, GeoBin happens to be the only company I know making a compost container like this. It comes rolled up tight, just in a tube. You can buy it online in a number of places. Costs about 40 bucks. And it's basically just a flat piece of plastic with these perforations, and you double it over at a certain point and you match up these slits. And then it comes with little kind of things you twist into each of these and you set it. So it can get quite a bit bigger than this. And depending on how much material you're going to put into it, and we'll look at this as my home example later on, you have a few different options. The California Master Gardeners did a series of YouTube videos a while back where they head-to-head compared a bunch of different, commercially available, like you can just purchase them, compost bins. Same inputs, same treatment, aged it, went through the whole process, and looked at which one made the best stuff. And this is the one that won. That's what put it on my radar. And it also happened to be by far the cheapest one. So started using it, and I've been very happy with that. I find, and one of the reasons why it did the best is because compared to like the more solid plastic compost bins, those can be hard to keep enough oxygen in them. They also can sometimes get a little too moist and too waterlogged, where these perforations, it stays relatively contained. It's not totally open, but it still allows for very good airflow, which was seen to be the main advantage. Now, if you have like heavy pest pressure from rats or rodents, you might find that this is not exactly what you want. But I live in a typical suburban neighborhood. We definitely have critters that come through and dig in our mulch in our yard overnight. This is also kind of high up a lot of times with those little critters, something that they really need to spend a lot of effort climbing into. They just don't have incentive to do it. I've never had a problem with anything digging around in these. And especially if you're not doing meat, dairy, bones, it's not going to really be attractive to the rats. If you want to, you can, this is essentially just a round bin with good airflow. If you want to, and I have in the past, you can just use like deer fencing to cut off a certain amount of it, put it in a loop, kind of fold it over and twist it with some needle nose pliers. Cuts, you can use pliers, but cut super easily with bolt cutters, and kind of make them. If you're wanting a bunch of them, or you have other uses for this 4-foot tall deer fencing, that will be cheaper. But if you only need one or two, like in this case, this roll is $67. You're not really going to be saving a whole lot of money. And they're kind of harder to work with. All of those cut areas, and even sometimes just where it's welded together, it's very sharp. I know people who have totally sliced themselves on this material before. So, kind of up to you. But if you need a bunch of them, or you have access to, part of a roll of this sort of stuff, for a long time, I normally run 2 bins. For a long time, I ran one of that and one just made with this material while I was assessing it. These days, I have 2 of these, and I find it easier to work with and a little less hazardous. This sort of general style, made by different brands, Soil Saver is one example of a common brand, is very typical. There are some that are round that are similar to this, where there are some perforations for airflow. There's some different settings, sometimes on the top where you can have it be a little bit propped open but still be closed. And if you need something because of pest pressure, because of where you are, that is totally contained for a backyard, this is a good option to go with. You see, like, these can get up to 246 gallons. These days, I don't quite the way I have mine set up. If that's the total capacity, maybe it's like 150. So this is a little bit smaller, but still a decent amount of compost. And then I really prefer these in terms of ease of use. If you can have 2 of them, in terms of letting one completely finish composting while you're feeding another one, and then you can harvest all the compost out of it at once as you're preparing for a new season. If you only have room for one, these can work, and I guess I'll just talk about it now. But what you would need to do to harvest the finished older stuff on the bottom is you would need to take this off, which isn't that difficult, like set it up next to it, fork off all the stuff on top back into it, and then harvest the bottom. The nice thing about these systems is that sometimes it's called like a flow-through design. Just a quick note before I forget, you would never want to do this on a paved patio. I guess this just manufacturer's display system. You always want to have your compost bin on top of either soil or mulch, because the moisture, you water it and different just kind of moisture accumulates, needs to be able to come through. This would just cause a mess over time because you will need to add water into it on the pavement. You never want it on decomposed granite. And so what happens with a system like this is that if you only have one, you're slowly feeding it, and then the stuff on the bottom is going to finish first, and you can open up the door at the bottom and just kind of scoop out what seems finished. And when you start hitting stuff that's not quite finished, you just stop. There's a little less airflow, and you have to be a little more careful about not accumulating too much moisture. It's sometimes a little hard to tell when you're adding moisture to your compost bin, like basically with a hose. The top might seem a little dry, and you might be getting pretty wet on the bottom. And if that does happen with a system like this, that's a little more open, it can kind of dry out and kind of equalize a little bit faster, where I have definitely seen these get really wet and sludgy if people are just adding too much moisture. So one thing to keep in mind, but I've known a number of people that are really happy with systems like this, produce really high quality compost. So it's definitely doable if you're really looking for something kind of totally enclosed. You will often see these things marketed. This one here is $94, most expensive, but I'll see things like these up to like $300. Only 37 gallons. I've lived somewhere for a while where there's just already one of these in the backyard, tried to maintain it. In my opinion, these things are junk. They sell them on the fact that it makes it very easy to turn. You can just spin these, but only 37 gallons. That's such a small amount of material, especially because as you add material, it keeps breaking down. In my opinion, they're expensive, and it's just hardly worth it. You definitely would never try doing hot composting. I've seen a picture actually recently of someone online said, I was able to do it, but they're not going to be able to maintain that high temperature for long enough to go through the whole process. I'm pretty positive. So generally, in my opinion, not really worth it. And then if something breaks in one of these little attachments, because there's a lot of weight when these are full, it's just, they become total junk. If any of you in attendance have really good experiences with this style, type in on the chat. I'd like to know about it. And then there's all sorts of fancy DIY or sometimes even expensive like cedar wood kits to purchase. In general, I don't think they offer much for most backyard composters. 3-bin systems, if they're used ideally, can be great for hot compost if you have a farm or access to all that material. With the 3-bin system, which sometimes you'll see, the wood ones oftentimes fall apart after not that long. If you're going to build one out of cinder blocks, that'll last a while because that concrete isn't going to rot with all that biological activity and moisture. The idea with the 3-bin system, just briefly, is that with hot compost, you need to be turning it a lot as you check the temperature. And then eventually it'll get to where you just leave it to finish kind of cooking down. And so with a 3-bin system, you can always be adding to a bin. And then when you need to turn that bin, you can just flip it back and forth. And then you can always have one on the end that's finishing cooking down. But again, like I've maintained those in a backyard context, and it's really didn't get better quality stuff, didn't get that high temperature consistently enough. The quality was fine, but it was no better and didn't really produce much faster than the cool pile that I'm about to kind of walk you through. So we are going to end with our last 15 minutes and then getting to questions with basically after all of this and learning about this for a long time, trying different things, traveling, looking at a lot of different people's setups as I've looked at gardens in different places. Here's what I've settled on works for me as someone who is a really active gardener, avid home cook, but doesn't want to maintain my compost pile like it's a pet with a lot of responsibility. I just want to lower that environmental impact and get a great product to help amend my garden. So I'm going to start with normal compost, and then we will end talking a little bit about worm compost and homemade worm bins. So this is on my kitchen counter. I have the little stainless steel pail. Doesn't need to be a stainless steel pail. The nice thing about them, I mean, they're overpriced, but the nice thing about them is that they will last absolutely forever. So bought one of these years ago. I think I got this one or my partner probably got it on sale at Ross. Sometimes you see them, locally. Most of these, for some reason, these stainless steel pails, I think it's so that the manufacturers can sell more stuff, come with what's called a carbon filter to quote, reduce the smell, where it's this little kind of almost like scrub sponge black fabric that goes in the top. And it ends up getting clogged up with food scraps and kind of being messy. And they say, leave them for a certain amount of time and then buy more and replace them. We just always, just use packaging tape to seal it up. If you cook a lot at home, it's not going to accumulate much stink if you just close those holes. Every 2-3 times a year, we just need to put more tape on. I've just never found one with the solid top. And if it starts to stink, you just dump it either in your 5-gallon bucket outside where you're accumulating scraps or in your compost pile. You don't want a stinky thing inside anyways. So there's the top. You can see there's just our solution. At our Waterwise Community Center for our compost piles, we have a couple of these around, but we often end up using, we're a government agency. We don't serve the best quality coffee at our meetings. There's just those plastic, almost 1 gallon size instant coffee containers around with a lid that kind of snaps on. We use those. They work just as well as the stainless steel things. So at my back step, I have a couple of 5-gallon buckets. You may or may not want these, right at your back step, depending on how nice things are right out your back door. But in general, I find it, I'll talk about your option if you want to do that. But in general, for me, I find it not worth my time to add just this little bit of compost every day or every other day into my bin. So what I do is I will accumulate normally over probably 2 weeks, 2 to 3 of these. And then every other weekend, add to the compost pile. It's easier to do. It lets me get a nicer mix and a more regulated volume. And that's for a household of 2 people who cook a whole lot. And then we're also harvesting vegetables. And so when you harvest vegetables, there's like the outer leaves and other things that are going into the compost. Really for the best quality, sometimes if it's 2 weeks in the summer, if I accumulate 3 of these, it's getting a little stinky and sludgy in time. And then as soon as I dump it into the compost pile and mix it with the wood chips, that goes away. If I did 2 or maybe 1, it might be a little bit better, but cool compost, make it work for your schedule, that's fine. If you don't want it to be stinky when you open up the top of the lid and dump it out, maybe only do 1 5-gallon, but that's still emptying this little guy from inside many, many times. And so that's the example of that one that I showed, the geo bin. This is it kind of totally flat. I'm kind of resetting up my second one after fully harvesting my compost pile. And so you can see here's the little doodads that go in and kind of twist and hold it together. You can see I'm not using the maximum size. What I have found is that I don't quite need the maximum size for the amount of output that I'm doing. This is the first time I'm tightening it up a little bit. And you just kind of experiment over time. And so here you can see I'm going to set up my next compost bin here, or pile. Here is the other one, just kind of finishing cooking down. And what you will see is it's amazing how much volume these will use. As you start adding to a new one, it's going to start filling up pretty quickly depending on the size, and you'll think, I'm going to fill it up and be done so soon. And then once it gets between 1/3 and 2/3 full, it's just always 1/3 to 2/3 full for a really long period of time. And then eventually I just get to the point where I want to let it finish fully breaking down. It will mostly break down very quickly, but want to let it finish fully breaking down. And so I'll just stop adding, even though I probably could continue because it will break down and lose some volume as I go, and start the new one. Where you want to put these is important for hot inland Southern California. If you're on the coast, maybe not as important. If you're in hot inland Southern California, if you can put it in part shade or shade, full shade, perfect, might not have it. Part shade, great. And here, it's open overhead, but it's near this wall in the afternoon, provides deep western shade. And there's a young but decent sized oak tree on the other side. So midday it gets full sun, but it gets significant shade. And that's just with where I would want to house this compost pile in my backyard. We have a kind of a back area that previous owners kept a dog back there. It's kind of in a weird kind of little corner. So it works out well for us for compost. And so this is it. If you don't have it fully open, it actually does stay up a little bit cleaner. And then another thing that I've done in the past, I just don't have any right now, and I keep forgetting to buy some, is at the nursery section of the big box hardware store, or a lot of local nurseries, they'll sell what are thin, straight, usually they're about 1/4 inch diameter green, fiberglass rods that they market for using as stakes for tomatoes. If you have happy tomatoes, they're not heavy duty enough or tall enough, but they work great to just slide through these and make the edges a little bit more rigid so things don't flop over. So someone just asked what's the placement if you're in a coastal location? Shade is still great. If you're in Southern California, where we don't really need to worry about, if you're in the Midwest and it gets super cold, you might need some sun to warm things up in the spring. We don't really, our compost piles will generate all their own heat from the microbiology, but it's just a little more forgiving on the coast because it's not 110 degrees in the summer usually. So you can get away with more full sun in the coast. And then another good question that came in, do I keep it open? What happens with the rain? So oftentimes with our first number of rains, they could use the moisture, that's fine. If it's a series of storms and I'm looking and it seems like it really is getting more than that well wrung out sponge, I'll just put a tarp over it and then just a couple of rocks down loosely. You don't want it real tight because you want that airflow, but if you put a tarp loosely over it, especially because it's not a hot system that really has that super high oxygen demand, it's still going to have enough airflow, and then that'll be just fine in the rain. And then in the summer, when I want to reduce evaporation, I'll normally have some broken cardboard boxes, which if they get moisture, will just eventually break down and add to the compost. The beneficial fungus actually really likes to break it down, but I'll just like lay in the top so the sun isn't directly beating down on the top of the compost. Some of that like broken, eventually it's like semi decomposed cardboard. And then if it really starts breaking down, I'll just kind of shred it, mix it in, and put some more on top. And then that can stay dry, or it could even get moist, but it's just a little bit of a barrier from the sun. Yeah, so that's a couple of questions answered about that. And then I'll get to all of these other questions. I see it's 11:54 already. And so I'm just going to plow through the rest of it. It's pretty simple, but just want to show you the pictures of the process. And then at noon, I'll stay after and I'll make sure I cover everyone's questions. So it's it sitting on top of just that same free wood chip mulch, just over soil so everything can drain out. And this is it. So basically what I do is when I'm picking up from the Waterwise Community Center, mulch to use in my yard, if I run low on my compost, I might just come pick some up and put it near my compost pile. I have mine open, but you can keep it in a covered trash can. And that's fine, just covered so that if it rains, it doesn't fill up with water. And or if I'm getting a full truckload to use in my landscape, I'll just save a little bit for the compost pile. Start by putting a layer 2, 3, 4 inches, whatever you have, of wood chips on the bottom. So always nice to start with that. And then here is so this, because I was taking pictures of setting this up to document for this class, I just used what I had, which was a little more than 1 bucket. So oftentimes, like I mentioned, I'll wait till I have a bit more than that. And so that gets dumped in the pile. And this is what you'll always have some moisture and a little bit of sludge when you're done, but I'll show you how I deal with that. And so this is what I have. And again, for something this wide, if I want to do a nice layer, a little bit more is useful. And I will, for people who just have a much smaller amount, there is a slightly different option. I will mention that after I show you the main way I deal with it. And so put it in, and then starting with our carbon layer on the bottom, now we've added our nitrogen layer, veggie scraps, all our coffee grounds, and then use some sort of fork. Shovel doesn't work very well. Some sort of digging fork like this is definitely what I find to be the best thing for compost. And then you might want to have gloves. Most of it doesn't get stuck, but every time I do it, some amount of stuff gets stuck. Sometimes you can just wipe it off the side. If you have a rigid plastic bin, you can definitely do that. I end up using a gloved hand just to slide some stuff off. No big deal. And you want to mix it together. If you really don't want to, you can just layer, but you're going to get less kind of little sludgy pockets and a more even mix, better output, helps the soil microorganisms get all around. Just lightly mix it. It doesn't need to be a workout. You don't need to reach way down because you're just mixing your layer that you're adding and the layer underneath. And so that's what I end up having. And so what I always do is using these buckets makes it easy because I put, that much nitrogen in, then I just fill up those same buckets with my wood chips as my rough measuring, and then I top it off with that much carbon. And by the time you're done with that, it's also kind of dried that out quite a bit. Another thing that I will do is I will check in. I didn't show pictures of it, but I will check in on the moisture level. So what I will do is usually I didn't need that much water or that much like right in one area because I was just getting it started. With this, I watered it down with a hose with like a water breaker and a shower nozzle attachment, and then kind of poked in with my fork a little bit. Sometimes with the mulch, it'll look wet on the top, but it won't really have penetrated. And again, you're going for that wrung out sponge. So every time I fill or add more to the compost, I'll poke a little bit deeper. Sometimes I'll even reach in with a gloved hand and take a look at it and check it on the moisture level. Usually, if it's the warm season in inland Southern California, I'm adding some water every time I do it, which is usually, again, every other week. If it's really hot out and I think about it, I might check on the weekend in between just to see. And what I'll normally do before I add the wood chip in is I'll start by just using my hose that I have nearby. I will spray out the buckets, and with the water in them, I'll dump into the bin, and then I'll add the wood chip, and then I'll add some more water. And essentially what you're doing is then that's ready. And then the next time you add your nitrogen, you add it right on top of that, you mix those together, and then you just add your carbon layer on top. I really prefer with any system, but especially with an open system, to have at least an inch or two of wood chip always on the top. That kind of acts like a carbon filter, helps any smells from getting out, keeps the bugs and the critters less interested. Sometimes if you've accumulated 2 or 3 of these buckets, even with that wood chip on top, it'll be a little bit stinky for 20 minutes or so after you're done. But usually, you come back a little bit later and you won't have any smells at all. And then that little bit of wood chip stuck to the sides, again, that's all carbon. So I'll just leave that in the bucket as I start refilling this, because a little bit of carbon is not bad to be in there. Pretty neutral. And if anything, it'll just make things a little less stinky. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick because we are almost out of time. It's the first time I've taught all of this as a online class. So I apologize for going a little bit over the noon mark. However, for any of you who do need to leave, you can catch the rest of it as on the YouTube posting of it at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And we're just going to keep getting through the rest of it. Won't be too much longer. So checking in on a finishing compost pile, the one on the right, I always, again, top off with a good thick wood chip layer as it's finishing. And you can see this is one where the last time we added to it was probably about 3 weeks ago, because then we started the new one. And you can see it's already quite broken down. It's the wood chip has a lot of breaking down to do, but the nitrogen, which is still there, I mean, you really can't identify much of the veggie scraps. You can tell by the texture that they're still a little slimy, but it smells like the forest floor, and that's how I know it's well balanced. The moisture is right. It's not anaerobic, and you can see in here worms kind of doing their thing. That also means that it's not too moist, not too dry. Good things are happening. Common in lots of Southern California to find in your compost pile are these crazy looking white grubs with these red, they're not actually their eyes, but kind of looks like it. There can be really chubby and kind of crazy looking. Don't be afraid of them. Those are just the grubs that turn into those green fig eater beetles that fly around. If you don't have figs or tomatoes growing in your yard, don't worry about them. You don't really need to worry about them, but they will eat figs and tomatoes. I actually have a little thing that I put them in, and some of our backyard birds, especially the scrub jays, they love to eat these. So it's a nice treat for the wildlife. I don't worry about picking them all out, but if they end up in my hand, I won't put them back in. And you can see this is like a little bit of eggshell. Always best to use a gloved hand as you're going through that, even though there's nothing too funky in there. And you can see, you'll see like white. This is the beneficial fungus working to break down different things inside. If it smells bad, there's something wrong. It shouldn't smell bad unless it's like you've just freshly jumped that vegetable bucket. If it is continuously smelling bad, that's the smell of anaerobic decomposition, which is the opposite of what we want. And there's only 3 things you might need. And so you can kind of do process of elimination. And it might be like multiple. You either need more air, more carbon, it's basically more of your wood chip mulch, or less moisture. Usually, if you add in some air and some more wood chips, mix it in some. So normally I don't turn, but that might be a time to really get in there a little bit more. That will normally fix it with our cool composting pile. It should smell neutral to kind of like forest floor. If you need to get some air in and you don't want to fully turn it, or it's not really that bad, but you're like, it looks a little moist, maybe it needs some air, you can without turning things around. And I don't like to turn unnecessarily because all those fungal threads that are getting going, those get shredded when you turn. So what I'll normally do, which, in this last compost pile run, I don't think I had to do this at all. But in this instance, I did want to get some more air in. They make this fancy like compost aerators and different tools, a 2-foot stick of rebar that you can buy pre-cut at the hardware store. Just jam that in the compost and spin it around in a bunch of different places. And that just gets some air down into it. Very cheap, easy solution. And then with the finished product, the very top is always going to stay kind of roughly mulch. And this is the very end of that pile. We harvested a number of times out of it, and then we always just topped off with some more mulch. And so knock that apart, and you can see fully broken down. You want to do something to sift it. There are, depending on how much compost you're making and your storage space, there you can really easily look up plans online. I apologize, I was going to include a picture of one and just forgot to do it, where you can use like 2x4s and some hardware cloth, which is the welded wire, kind of you get at the hardware store where the chicken wire is, but it's thicker and it's little squares, and you can get it like in a 1/2-inch square, and you can make something with that backed by 2x4s that can slide back and forth on a wheelbarrow and really efficiently sift it. I haven't gotten around to making one of those, but what I use are just, if you have access to or can scavenge one, this is just a flat where you buy like 4-inch plants from the nursery. And the underneath part, there's a variety of different designs, but there happens to be one where there's just like this little smaller grid in it. And to me, that's like a perfect, if you're just sifting small amounts at a time, very effective, and sifts it kind of just to the right size. So a couple of small shovel loads on there. And it's so easy to shake it back and forth because it's relatively small. I find that I've never gotten around to making that other style because, well, one, if my partner was here, she would say that she ends up sifting most of the compost. And two, the last time I did it, this is just, you can shake this so quickly, it's less stuff to move around than the big ones with the 2x4s, that it probably processes just as quickly and it's less stuff to store. So you can see there are some, wood chips, larger bits of that. And so I just kind of shake that over a bucket. And here's the wood chips that are left. Most of the compost goes through those wood chips right back into the new compost pile, inoculating with that good soil biology. If you are using this as a top dressing underneath fruit trees, like, you're just adding it onto an area that's already mulched, you wouldn't even need to sift it because it's going to be a combination of mulch and the compost. But if you're using it for vegetable gardens, I really do prefer to get out all of this larger stuff. And then you're just left with, something like that. Very nice product. You can see there's still lots of nice structure. There's a few little things that get through, but it's much less. Really great final product. And then even after you sift it, if it's going to not all get used, or when it's finishing cooking down, remember to check the moisture of that as well. Don't let it dry out. So even my pile that's finishing cooking, whenever I fill my new pile, I'm also poking around in the old pile, seeing if I need to add some moisture to that as well. So where do you locate your compost bin in Southern California? We talked about shade on top of bare soil. And then the only thing we haven't talked about is within easy range of a hose, because you're going to need to be washing your buckets and adding moisture. So I like that 2-pile strategy, but I don't really need to cover this. It's just like what we talked about when we looked at that 1 bin compost system. It's I would prefer that kind of flow through design if you only have room for 1 bin. And so now we are going to end up with worm bins made simple, because you don't need to spend $300 getting a worm bin set up. And why would we want to use worm bins? Well, composting with worms is a great way that people without a yard or without space for composting can still do some compost. If you don't have the space to compost, you're not going to process all of your kitchen scraps with the worm bin. But it's more like a cool project where you can still do something. And even for someone in an apartment, or a condo with just like a balcony, you can worm compost. And the worm compost, even though you won't get a ton of stuff from it, it's great for potted plants on the balcony, or even house plants, as long as if you're doing it all inside, you don't have gnats or anything like that. Worm compost is super high quality. It's got like, it's some of the top stuff for that great beneficial biology. So how we talked earlier about that little bits of compost, like the probiotics, you might have your bulk compost, which is still going to be higher quality than what you can purchase. And then your worm compost is going to be super great stuff. It's a fun thing to keep going with the kids, poke in, feed it. It's less work than a dog, but it is more responsibility than a normal compost pile. One of the main reasons is that you need to make sure that the moisture level is right, because they can dry out. And you also need to keep them cool. In their soil, you need to keep them below 84 degrees. They can actually, the worms that we use for compost, red wigglers, can die above 84 degrees. Now it can be higher than 84 degrees outside, because we're talking about like the soil temperature where they are. And they'll know to go to like the inside of the worm bin. But it's still in inland Southern California, that can be kind of difficult. We actually, so I showed you, we don't really feel like we need a worm bin anymore, because there's so many worms in our main compost pile, which that compost pile is big enough that it really does have a lot of buffer if it does get really hot outside, to not have the soil temperature get high, and those worms can go right down into the soil below if they need to, and a little bit below the surface of the soil. It's pretty consistently 55 degrees. That's just kind of how it is vast majority of places on the earth. However, I will say that the worm bin that my partner and I were keeping, even moving it to the shadiest spot of our yard, keeping it as cool as possible, doing everything other than bringing it inside the house, which had not been set up to be living inside the house. We have a lot of cats who would be very interested in it. In that 119-degree day that we had over the summer, we did lose all of our worms in our worm bin, and it was pretty sad. And so we're not keeping worms right now, because our normal compost piles are attracting enough. If you buy a worm compost bin online, usually it's going to be something that looks like this. Some of them are black. Usually they're going to cost $100. They're going to have a spout at the bottom. They will talk so much about how the worm juice coming out the bottom with the spout is great stuff, and you really want something like this. You don't need all of this. And the reality is that what I learned from the people who I was learning about from this is that if you're really keeping the moisture where it should be in your worm bin, it's still going to be like that wrung out sponge where it's damp, but there's not a lot of free water coming through. There shouldn't be a lot of what's called leachate, free moisture coming out at the bottom, to where you're going to have a lot of this stuff. And so you don't really need this if you're doing a good job. You do need worms though. And if you know someone with a worm bin, worms keep reproducing. And then if there's, kind of the maximum population, they really slow down. So if you know someone with a successful worm bin, they can probably give you some worms to get started, and then their worms will just reproduce. If not, you're going to be ordering online, and that will cost something. Usually for the kind of worm bin I'm going to show, you'll start with about 500 worms, and that will cost about $45 plus shipping online. So it is some investment. And these are what are called red wiggler worms. They work very well. They're communal feeders. They'll be, on top of each other, all feeding together when you feed them. They like that. Night crawlers, which are the bigger white worms, they are often found in good garden soil. They're both often found in good garden soil, even though neither of them are the common ones that we see in our backyards are native to California. But they are territorial and solitary. So those big white ones are not what would work well in a worm bin. So I'm going to keep this very simple. And your container also needs bedding. If you have a compost pile, that like mostly broken down compost is fine for bedding. If you're starting from scratch, the best thing that works is it's called coco coir. It's shredded coconut fiber. It comes in a compressed block. The thing tells you, packet tells you how much water to add to it. You kind of let it expand in the water, and then it turns into this fluffy material. You can order it online, but these days in Southern California, a lot of neighborhoods have hydroponic stores and used very differently. It also is used as a hydroponic growing medium. So you call ahead, but locally, I've bought this at a local hydroponic store. And worms. Feed most of the stuff that you would feed into our cool compost piles. The only things that you want to avoid are onions and citrus, and also pineapples. They don't like the acidity. And then there's a compound in the onions and the garlic and stuff that they don't like. They love greens, melon, apples, fruits, coffee grinds in moderation. Too much coffee grinds, like you wouldn't want to do all coffee grinds. That could be too acidic, but a decent amount of coffee grinds and avocado, even if it's just like the little bits left. And hopefully you don't have rotten avocados. But that's all good. Root vegetables, they'll eat, but they're much slower to break down. The smaller the pieces are and sometimes the more moist stuff, they'll go through quicker. And banana peels, sometimes banana peels really will attract fruit flies. Sometimes supposedly from the grocery store, the eggs are on the outside. So it doesn't matter if there's some flies and other little critters in your worm bin, as long as your worms are happy. So banana peels, not a ton, but some, because they take a while to break down. An outside worm bin are fine. Inside, you probably don't want to mess with it because you might get fruit flies or gnats. And then if they're happy, they'll eat half their body weight per day, but they will slow down in the cold weather. You can bring them into a garage or something like that in the cold weather. Might keep them happy. They're adapted to being outside in Southern California, not in a real deep freezing climate, but they will slow down. And you're not going to know exactly how much body weight of your worms are. So it's a bit of trial and error. Check back in, make sure that they are eating it and that there's not just a bunch of food rotting, getting kind of funky and nasty and attracting flies and gnats. And this is all you need for a worm bin. A short, wide storage bin. I actually do prefer the Rubbermaid Roughneck brand. The cheaper ones that are kind of that more brittle plastic just don't hold up outdoors as long. I've used all sorts of storage bins for garden projects, and these ones, which are a bit more expensive, just last better. 1/4-inch drill bit, drainage holes in the bottom. Could be more than this. This worked fine for us. We were pretty careful and good about not accumulating too much moisture. But if you're doing it for the first time, it certainly doesn't hurt to have more drainage holes in the bottom. And then the worms need oxygen too. So drainage holes around the upper top. In this case, we had drainage holes in our lid as well. But you don't necessarily need that. And in fact, it can be easier not to have it because then you don't need to worry as much about rain. So you can do quite a bit larger or quite a bit more drainage holes or drilled holes around the upper top just for that air exchange. Definitely want to keep it in the shade. Full shade really is what you want for a worm bin, especially if you're inland. And then again, considering a contingency plan to bring them in the house and put them somewhere if it's really hot. A lot of people in apartments will have them underneath the sink and they're perfectly happy living there. And so that's really what it is. And then you fill with the bedding if you're using the coir or your compost. Here is where we had it in our corner on top of a milk crate, just kind of keeping some separation from the soil. If there's separation from the soil on top of a milk crate is perfect. The worms, as long as they're happy, they won't leave, even through the holes on the bottom. If they're stressed, they will try to leave. And then because we had holes in our top, in the rainy season, we just had an extra storage bin top with a rock on top of it. If it's windy, make sure that it's not going to go anywhere. If it does get a lot of water in it, it might get temporarily too wet. That's why you need those drainage holes so the worms don't drown. And then you look inside our bin. You can see here's what we had, some greens breaking down, a little bit of cardboard. They actually like just fine. And you can see the partway broken down coir, finishing breaking down. And when you feed them, best little handfuls and then bury it. And then that will make it easier access for the worms. And then you can just kind of do another handful next to it, kind of all the way around. If you do it kind of in a loop, you'll know that you're feeding too much if you get back and the first stuff has not been fully eaten. And so that's kind of what it looks like partway through. You can see the little worms, same thing. wrung out sponge is your moisture. Harvesting can do a few different ways, a few different strategies. What I like to do for harvesting is just start only feeding on one side of the worm bin for quite a while, a number of weeks. All the worms will go there. And then you can take most of the finished worm castings out of the other side of the worm bin, fill that side back with some more bedding, and then start to add more food into it. And then eventually, kind of do the opposite. And then when you bring it out, if there's still a bunch of worms in it, what you can do is you can make little piles of it and kind of put it out in not a super hot, but a sunny place. And all the worms will go to the bottom to avoid the heat. You can harvest off the top and plop any of your worms back in. And we already talked about where to locate it. And so that's our conclusion. What I'm going to do is, I really hope that this really helped provide both some demystification about compost and mulch and provided you some real straightforward, very simple, easy to do at home strategies. So before you log out, it's very brief, just a few questions. I'm going to launch our final evaluation poll. This is the first time that we have taught this topic online. Normally, this is the active class out in our demonstration garden. We only do a little bit inside, and then we look at compost piles, look at building compost pile, look at mulch. So thank you for sticking with us. Even though it went long, it was a lot to try to cram in. And in addition to quickly filling out the poll, and I will start answering all the remaining questions in a second. If there is anything, any other feedback that doesn't fit in the poll, either things that have been useful for you, things that worked, or also if there's anything that wasn't clear, please let us know in the chat. I read all of them and we really take that information to heart, want to know what's working for people and what is not working for people. And so with that, I'm going to go back to the question and answer and start going through all of that. Let's see. Okay, that person is not here. Let's see if Claire is still with us. Claire is still with us. So Claire had a question. We get both fruit flies and ants in our enclosed bin, exactly like the one we showed. How do you prevent them? So I will say as long as everything is going in the right direction, first thing to do is just kind of accept that there's going to be some critters around. With fruit flies are attracted to even the littlest hint of anaerobic decomposition. So really smell, and not just kind of like at the top, but pull out some handfuls, go a little bit, dig a little bit deeper down, make sure things aren't too wet, see if there's any signs of things being too wet, a little bit stinky. If that's the case, then you can either add a little bit more of that carbon or make sure that things aren't getting too moist farther down. Ants are difficult seasonally, especially in the summer when moisture is short. I do sometimes get Argentinian ants, which are just they're all over the place in Southern California these days. They're little black ones that also are really aggressive with bringing aphids and scale to your garden plants. I do sometimes get those in my compost. And I honestly don't worry about it in my compost unless it's like really crazy. If I do see that they have a colony in there, like sometimes I'll turn that area some and hope that they kind of leave. And then the only other thing to really do for ants is it's not certified organic, but it really is a pretty harmless ant-specific pesticide, which is basically just borax, like the stuff that people used to use as a laundry ingredient, called Taro is the brand. Specifically their ant bait. They have other stuff that's broad spectrum that I would never use in my yard, but their ant bait, which you can get at any hardware store, is literally just like a sugar gel with some borax in it. And they have outdoor baits that you can put, like I've had to use them, your fruit trees where the ants keep coming and ranching aphids and scale. And so you can try that, and it's basically something that they bring back to their colony, and it's safe for being around people and dogs and all that sort of stuff. I generally try to use nothing, but that's one. It's just borax, and occasionally I'll use it if I need to. Let's see, from Mark. Can you use cardboard as your brown element? You absolutely can use corrugated cardboard as part of your brown element. It's very high in carbon. What you're going to want to do is kind of rip it up, and like normally if I use it, I'll kind of rip it up and kind of crumble it up into little balls. And when you do that, it's actually great because there's usually like a decent amount of air around them. So as they become like farther deeper down in the compost, they help provide some nice aeration. And the beneficial fungus loves the corrugation in cardboards, those areas that like have that air, and they actually love breaking down the glues in the cardboard as well. And so you'll see those, like they start to get white with those fungal colonies so quickly. It is quite a bit of work to rip it apart and crumble it up. So if I have some extra boxes, like I'll add it kind of as a supplement sometimes as like a treat for the fungus. But the amount of work it would take for me to shred all that cardboard by hand to kind of replace the wood chip element would be a lot. And I think with the structure as well, with the wood chips, because there's some finer shreds, it can really kind of mix very nicely with the nitrogen stuff. It might be hard to fully mix if it's all cardboard, but certainly as part of it, definitely. Do I cut banana peels, etc.? I absolutely don't do it for my normal compost pile. When they go in the worm, I don't think we've ever used a lot of banana peels in the worm bin. I mean, it wouldn't be a bad idea to pull them apart. For people who are super into their worms, they'll actually make like a smoothie out of like all their various, like add a little water and like their apple cores or banana peels or like melon rinds, and the worms love that because, you know, they have tiny mouths and they kind of need to wait till things are partially rotted. And with that smoothie approach, as long as you're not adding too much moisture, they can go right to it. Again, that's if you're going to really treat your worms as your pets, go for it. But other than that, it might be more work than you want to put into it. For Heather, can I use shredded paper? So traditionally, people have used shredded like matte paper, either like office paper, which is black and white printing, or sometimes newspaper for worm bin bedding, if that's what you're talking about. I don't like that as much as the coir. Certainly you can use some, like if you have, you know, some documents that you really want to get rid of, certainly compost them away. But the shredded paper, when it gets wet, tends to mat down some. And so it's not as kind of fluffy as either using some partially finished compost or coir for the worm bin. It can kind of get a little waterlogged. In terms of shredded paper in a larger compost pile, certainly, just like the cardboard, I don't think it would work just structurally to be like a main element of the carbon, but as a supplement, or if you have some stuff you want to get rid of, sure. If you do it matte paper only, not like shiny stuff, or like, you know, if you're doing it with junk mail, make sure like the little like mailer envelope, the clear stuff is not part of it, but just plain paper, sure. From Cat, does solarizing a veg bed before planting harm the soil food web system? Great question. Earlier this year, I did some reading on that, found out that there's actually been quite a lot published on it by different university extension systems, because it is a popular weed abatement approach for small organic farms. And what will happen is within the heated area, so top 4 inches or so of soil, it will either kill everything or like earthworms will just go farther down. However, it's been well documented at this point in time that for whatever reason, the good guys from the soil food web system are much faster to recolonize after solarization, which for those of you who don't know what it is, and which will be many of you, sorry I jumped into it, that's covering your soil tightly with clear plastic after your soil has been like irrigated to have good moisture into it, and leaving it there for like 2 months in full sun in the middle of summer kills turf with some caveats, tends to kill weed seeds. And it does actually kill pathogens in the soil, and then the good guys are faster to return. So within small-scale organic farming systems, it is recognized as a way to help with soil disease because of that fact. So that's basically the extent of what I know about that. If any of you want to learn more about solarization, is used in full sun sometimes in hot inland Southern California as a way to deal with part of the killing a lawn process. We cover solarization with other techniques in our killing your lawn or removing your lawn the right way class, which we have a recording of on our YouTube channel. From Sitlal, hope I'm pronouncing your name right. My worm gets taken over by black soldier fly larvae. Is there a reason, or is it merely because I leave the lid open? Good question. So black soldier fly larvae are very common in worm bins. And if you have chickens absolutely love them. Most people don't though. I would definitely keep the lid closed. I mean, some small holes in the lid, if you're worried about aeration, are fine. Maybe a little smaller than a 1/4 inch and more to make sure that you can help keep the flies out. As long as your worms are happy, there is some amount of capacity for the worms and the black soldier fly larvae to coexist. But I have also seen black soldier fly larvae and no worms. So I would say keep the lid closed, and then make sure that, again, things aren't too wet, so where there's not that anaerobic decomposition attracting the flies. Also make sure things aren't too dry, because if you go through a period that's too dry and the worms have the opportunity to leave town or kind of dry up and the niche is open, that might make it easier for the black soldier fly larvae to totally take over. And then also, I mean, when you want worms, you normally want worms, but black soldier fly larvae also eat and poop out a high quality product as well. So they're doing some amount of composting for you. Can you use slightly molded grass clippings in your compost pile, Georgina? Absolutely. I mean, that the slight mold on them, those are some of the same microorganisms that are going to be breaking down the stuff in your compost. It's just kind of already gotten going outside of the pile. From Kat, is buying soil microbes effective to help build a good soil, or is this unnecessary? Very controversial question. I've tried to look into this quite a bit. Here's what I have come up with in terms of my practice. If there's soil that's kind of doing okay, like it grows plants fine, if your soil has not been through trauma, then chances are you don't need it. Most of those microbes are going to be everywhere, and your gardening practices and building structure can then help push things in the right direction, especially if you already have a decent loamy soil and kind of good spaces for them. If you have terrible soil structure, buying those microbes outside of bringing in organic matter, I don't feel is going to help that much, because, you know, if you have compaction, you're still not going to have, like we looked at that picture, those good homes for those microbes yet. The only time that I will use those beneficial soil microbes specifically is if I am starting a, like vegetable beds in a new place. Whether it's in the ground or raised, I will usually buy a high quality fertilizer from a well-recognized name brand like Dr. Earth or EB Stone, or I think some of the Kellogg fertilizers have the added microorganisms that I get from a nursery where I know it's not stored in full sun. And I will add those when I'm adding my organic matter as just like an initial. It's not going to cost a ton of money, and just kind of making sure I'm setting everything off in the right direction. After that, if you're taking care of your soil well, those microbes will do their thing. You don't need to keep adding every year. Sometimes, depending on if you end up using fertilizers, like I still do for most vegetable beds, in addition to compost, you want to use a bit of organic fertilizer to really get your best harvest. And if the fertilizer brand I am using happens to have that stuff, great. I don't necessarily seek that out in my organic fertilizer. And then also if I'm doing like a raised bed with imported soil, that soil, even if it's sandy loam soil, has all been through trauma. It's been scooped up, trucked around, sat in full sun in soil yards. And then even though over time the microbes deeper down in that garden soil might bring themselves kind of up into that soil, I mean, for a few raised beds, the amount of time or the amount of money needed to buy some fertilizer that's going to have that stuff in it is so minimal compared to the investment of like building a raised bed. I'll just go for it. In terms of general planting of like general landscape material, I will only use those microorganisms if, like on commercial scale sites where I've done garden projects where it used to be a parking lot, I'll do that as kind of a little bit of an insurance policy to help get things going. But in general, gardens, like taking out a front yard lawn and putting in a Waterwise garden, I'd save your money. In my experience, if you do all the rest of the horticulture right, things are going to grow well and your soil will get going on its way. So getting almost to the end of the questions. If you have more questions, send them in, because if we run out, we will stop the class. Also from Kat, if you plant a cover crop between vegetable seasons, how do you incorporate that without disrupting the soil food web system? Good question. Also, when harvesting, do you recommend leaving the roots of your plants in the bed? Another good question. So I'd say, Kat, so cover crop are sometimes in between vegetable seasons or to rest a bed. You'll grow some plants, but not necessarily for the harvest. And some of those plants are ones that are particularly good at improving the soil. It depends on your scale, Kat. I'm going to assume that, like most of us, you're kind of an avid backyard gardener, and we'll answer the question kind of like that, and not kind of like on a farm scale system. So yeah, winter season, same thing in my backyard vegetable bed. We don't need quite as much space in the winter for what we want to grow. So we have some areas devoted to cover crop that's coming in. Depends on the root system of what you're growing. If it's stuff that's easy to cut at the top, so like if you're doing a legume cover crop, peas, fava beans, something like that, or in the summer, even like buckwheat, kind of coming through with a some sort of like harvesting sickle and just kind of cutting everything like right at the base, putting the tops as a good nitrogen input into your compost pile after maybe like hacking it up some more with a machete or something like that, and leaving all the roots in the bed to decompose is generally how I will approach things in my vegetable beds to stick with kind of that no-till approach after establishment. However, it depends what you're going for. If you're really feeling like you need to add bulk organic matter deeply through that soil profile, you might say, well, this year's going to be an exception. I'm going to mow down, shred up all that cover crop stuff, depending on your setup with a lawnmower, a string trimmer, or whatever. And I will actually dig this year. And then in subsequent years, I won't dig. That is an approach. It's not like if you dig once, your whole garden is going to fall apart. If that's what you want to do, especially if you're growing grasses in your cover crop, you're really going to need to kind of use like a rototiller to get those down into the bed, which I really don't like to do. If I dig, I do try to hand dig, but I mean, people use cover crops and till them in all the time on organic farms that do very well. It's just different styles. So it's whatever is going to work for you with your goals at that point in time. I tend to avoid dogma in terms of like never dig, never till. I've just seen too many different approaches used very successfully over the years to say only one is going to work. In general, I will leave most of the roots of most of my vegetable plants in the ground to decompose, and just kind of reach my pruners in and cut like an inch or so below the surface and let things decompose. Sometimes as I'm pulling things out, I'll just kind of rip at the base, and normally by the end of the season, if the stub is going to be in the way, like part of it'll give, and then I'll just cut like at the biggest roots, and maybe I'll take out like, a couple inches of the root system, but all the small roots I do leave in to decompose. And that's just kind of like that stuff breaks down and kind of compost in place in the ground with the soil food web over time in the veggie bed. From Sharon, will applying mulch over cardboard get rid of those nasty stolons that run deep? So probably talking about Bermuda grass. It will help, but if you have Bermuda grass, it won't take care of it. It will help smother it. The important thing with the cardboard is to have, if you have those plants with stolons, probably mostly Bermuda grass, I am for largest cardboard pieces I can find and about a 9-inch overlap where cardboard pieces come together. Because if you only have an inch or two, the Bermuda grass can just kind of grow up and weave its way through. And then mulch on top of that is good. Generally, if there's still a lot of activity, I'll try not to plant in that area in at least for a couple of months to let things rot down underneath. The most effective control is going to be during the active growing season of that plant. So ideally it would be like 2 months in the summer. No matter what you do, some amount will find its way through and start growing in the mulch. The key is it's certainly going to be a lot less than if you didn't go through that process, and you're just going to have to be on weed patrol. So like if you use that technique to take care of Bermuda grass for the first year, every weekend, be out there. It might only take 5 minutes, but as soon as you see stuff coming up, dig it out. I like to use a tool called a hori hori. It's a Japanese garden knife where you can pretty accurately just dig in one small area. You don't need to get a big shovel out there. It's got a kind of semi-serrated blade on one side and really lets you get in there and pop out as many roots as you can. Just stay on top of it. Eventually, you'll be able to transition from every week to every other week to once a month. And the goal would be like to a few times a season. The reality is, like for my front yard, that's part of the process I use to take out the Bermuda grass. I'm on a cul-de-sac with a bunch of neighbors with Bermuda grass lawns that sometimes go to seed. I'm probably going to need to do some Bermuda grass patrol, once a month or so forever, but it gets to be less and less. So for example, this weekend, I just noticed that after probably not pulling up Bermuda grass for at least a month, maybe 6 weeks, it's coming up again in some areas. That's just going to be part of it. But with my mulch and my native plants growing in, that's the only weed that regularly comes up. A couple of dandelions every once in a while. So still a lot less work than maintaining a lawn or most other types of gardens. Okay, I think that is the all of the questions. I'm just looking back through the chat. And we've covered all those questions again. Let's see, is Gloria still here? Gloria J. Berry. Gloria had an irrigation related question. And I think that'll be our last one. So Gloria asked, do I recommend WUCOLS, which is a water use classification system for drip irrigation, fruit trees, and plants for scheduling watering? Somewhat, but within WUCOLS, there is a very large range. It's without anything better to do, that process is the way to go, but make sure, so WUCOLS will give you your you can use like your plant factor for your plants, but you need to find your local weather data and some other stuff. What I would recommend, Gloria, is we go quite a bit into how to do all of this, as well as drip irrigation systems for fruit trees in a online workshop that we have recorded on our YouTube channel. And if really, it's a whole 3-hour workshop. Only part of that's on the irrigation scheduling. So I would encourage you to check out, and you can click through and advance to find the scheduling part if you want. The workshop is, I'm going to get the exact wording wrong, but it's something like efficient irrigation for fruit trees and vegetable gardens. And that's a whole class that is really going to be based around probably that information that you are wanting to know. And so I would encourage you to check that out. Okay, thank you for staying through a great question and answer period, everyone. I think that's going to be some great questions for us to have recorded for the web posted version of this class. So again, after some light editing, if you want to refer back to it, we will have this up on our YouTube channel. You can get to at cbwcd.org/YouTube next week. And thank you very much for joining us. Hope you sign up for our newsletter as well and join us for future programs. Have a good rest of your weekend, everybody.